Then we'll reconvene the meeting, and we'll pick back up with utility services, item 12G3, which is a reuse plan. And good afternoon, Mr. Burke. Welcome again.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. For the record, Vincent Burke, Director of Utility Services. We are talking about the reuse plan. So on October 24th of this year, the Board of County Commissioners requested staff to obtain more details and evaluate a potential pressurized reuse study. We had talked about increasing our septic to sewer and the fact that there were some portions of the county, especially in the southern area of the county, that would potentially be eligible for some pressurized purple pipe. So back in the budget, you may or may not recall that staff had put some professional services in the fiscal year 18-19 budget, some dollars for looking at a reclaimed, if you will, master plan update, since one has not been done in quite some time. So we wanted to make the board aware that with certain parts of a pressurized system, if that becomes feasible, that there's additional permitting requirements to expand the service area, and there's a cross-connection control plan with respect to potable water and devices that help the reverse flow of protecting the public water supply. So there's additional, I think, research that needs to be done with expansion of a pressurized system. We need to also possibly look at some LDRs with respect to new construction, as well as what it would take to bring in some pressurized purple pipe. We'd be, in essence, running a secondary water system for irrigation quality water. We had also mentioned in the agenda item that as part of the franchise agreement that the town of Indian River Shores allotted to the county to provide irrigation water to customers, the John Zion Water Management folks customers, there is a timeline with respect to trying to serve additional customers on the barrier island. So this agenda is broken into twofold processes. One is the county pressurized feasibility study to look at where we have lines, where we need to have lines. The second part is to do a separate study with respect to a pressurized flow on the barrier island. So again, staff has budgeted for evaluation of the wastewater effluent disposal and expansion of the pressurized reuse system in the fiscal year 18-19 budget. And staff would recommend the Board of County Commissioners consider the following two options. Option one is to authorize staff to negotiate a cost proposal with one of the engineering firms on the CCNA, the Continuing Consulting Engineering Services Agreement. Note that there's specific limits on the CCNA agreements that we cannot exceed per Florida statute, so we'd be mindful of that when we bring something back to the board. The evaluation include the funding requirements, build-out scenarios, land development regulation changes, regulatory compliance, and the sources of funding. And so it'd be a multi-month process to look at the holistic side of pressurized system. The second is to authorize staff to negotiate a cost proposal in concert with the franchise agreement requirements of the town of Indian River Shores to look at the feasibility of doing a pressurized reuse system along the A1A corridor on the barrier island. I'm available for any questions the board may have.
Commissioners, questions of any? Commissioner
Yes.
Zork?
Right now, you're just looking at the A1A type of corridor for the pressurized side. Are you also looking at the mainland side? And it's kind of a two-edged sword. Reuse is great, but the cost, if you approve a new subdivision today that might have reuse in 5 years, you put the lines in today, in 5 years, those lines may have issues or problems with them sitting dormant. Not necessarily the main feeder line, but the individual lot service lines and whatever type of connection device. Indian River Club on the mainland is the only, that I know of, pressurized neighborhood system. And it requires, I believe, 2 full-time staff members from Indian River Club to always be tweaking and working with that system because it's very challenging. And they may have a fixed amount of water that makes it harder to balance out each person's flow on their yard, and if the yard's different, needs more gallons. You know, I don't know how they work that out. But as we keep adding things that drive up the cost of housing on the mainland, as we're looking for our places for our teachers and first responders and those folks to live, I don't know what the cost per house would be, but it wouldn't be much different, I don't think, than an ERU for water today, or it would be in that ballpark, potentially, which then you're looking at adding another significant cost item, you know, to those houses. So we have to look at the benefit cost side of it. On the beach, you know, adding $1,500 to a house that costs $400, it's not a big deal. When it's a habitat house on water side that's, you know, $112,000 and you add $1,500, it's a different relative percentage effect to the cost to the homeowner.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. That'd be part of the, so for the county-wide pressurized system, that'd be something we'd be looking at, is obviously what the upfront cost could be for, say, a new development versus the ongoing cost. And you're absolutely right. When you're running a separate pressurized system, there's costs that we, the utility, incur for any kind of breaks in that line and on-call folks that may have to respond after hours on the weekends. But then you have nozzles, replacements, weed whackers hitting the device. Now you see guys are shooting up under a pressurized system. So there's maintenance on both sides.
Right.
That could be considered. Yep.
So just keep all that in mind as you're
Bring that back.
thinking through. Is there any other counties that have models, ordinances, or procedures for a pressurized reuse system that you know of? I mean, I don't, so I'm
Sure,
just,
there are. We can look at, yeah, there are some large utilities like in Orlando area and certainly down south that do have some pressurized system that's already set out there. Tampa's a big one as well, where they're able to reduce some of their potable water consumption, specifically instead of irrigating. for
right, okay.
irrigation.
Which that would be a good offset when you can do that. In Orlando, anytime they build a new road, they put in the purple pipe dry as a master line.
But you're right, you do have that lot rot, so if your gaskets are sitting there for an
Yep.
extended period of time, you have some issues, especially if you're gonna go to pressure test that 5 or 6 years down the road. Yep.
Right, it's a big problem. All right, thank you.
Any other commissioners? Commissioner Sly.
Vinny, a couple questions. One is, the first one may sound silly, but just want to make sure that I'm right on this. We have no plans for using potable water for the reuse lines.
That's correct.
Okay, and I just do that because I paid for a separate line in the city of Vero Beach, an irrigation line, about 12 years ago, rather than digging a well, and I'm still getting potable water through it. So I just want to make sure we have no plans for using potable water for.
We don't, but one word of caution is, we've had some developments where there's zero lot lines, if you will. They cannot put in a private well, and they have chosen some of the folks to use potable water for irrigation purposes. That's part of our education requirements. We don't certainly encourage that, but I'm just here to say that there are some of those that do exist.
Yeah, I'm sure that there are probably some thousands around the county where it exists, because it's the only water available. I just want to make sure we don't go down a wrong path. The second part of it, would this be it seems to me, and again, just guesswork on my part, that there'd be certain neighborhoods or developments that would use a much higher percent of their water as irrigation water. As part of your reuse study, would there be any ability to either look at customer accounts to get some estimates of that, or have the consultant take a look at different communities and to sort of, in some sense, prioritize them? Or so you can have, see if you have a cluster of these type of high-use communities? So I think that if that's possible, that ought to be part of the study.
Okay.
Because again, I think what you already have planned down A1A is absolutely in the right spot, because a lot of those communities have significantly sized yards where they're using automatic water all the time, and that would seem to me to be a great place for you. So those are my two questions, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
No, Mr. Chairman, I just want to add that the last time we discussed this, I did bring up concerns for agriculture, and now there's been a lot more information about the use of reuse with agriculture, and insofar as if it's not a contact fruit or vegetable or an in-ground growth, then it's fully acceptable. And I learned that, so I just wanted to share that. Earlier, I had showed some concerns, but in elements like of citrus and of any fruit that's bared above ground, it is an acceptable use. So, and they approve it.
Commissioner, are you referring back to Mr. O'Dare's request?
Yes, yes.
All right. I'll be glad to bring that back if
Yes.
if you think it's worth some more discussion, and then we can decide if we want to chase that down or not, because I know you did have some concerns on that, but I'll be glad to bring it back.
So great comments. We would take all that. We would be able to come back then at some future point in time for board review and approval of 2 of those studies.
Okay. And then, Vinny, the question I had, I envisioned this to be kind of just like our potable water. So the reuse would come off a main pipe, and then there'd be a stem coming off to somebody's yard to a meter, I would guess. And then they would hook up to that, and then it would go into their irrigation system. Is that kind of how it would work? We pressurized it or not?
Maybe depending on the development. Sometimes we would anticipate like a master meter, where we'd maybe come into a particular development.
master
They already
meter,
have an existing pumping station, so in lieu of the groundwater, we'd be able to tie into the suction side of their pump, and then like for Indian River Club, for example, they pick up out of a pond and then they send it out to all the homes. I don't think we would go to each home, but we would go to that pump that then distributes it to each home.
Okay, so that was my question about you had some in the backup here about how St. John's does not allow reuse in a pond like that if it has an outflow to the lagoon. And so I guess in my mind, I'm trying to get a handle on, if we pressurize it, do we have to go into a pond, or can we just individually per lot have it pressurized each lot?
You can do individual per lot, yep. And
Okay.
some of those requirements as far as the TMDLs kind of are not applicable since you're just applying directly at the residential house, so.
Okay.
We had Lakes Waterway Village, which is a perfect example where we were gonna send 1 million gallons of reuse. There was infrastructure put in place, but because of the outfall, one, we weren't able to do dual purpose of stormwater retention / reuse / TMDL concerns. So the district said even though it's beneficial reuse over here, we were not able to put our reuse into their pond.
Okay. Would you envision that the reuse water would first go to our west wastewater wetlands and then go from there to the subdivisions, or would it go directly from the treatment plant?
Now, I envision we'd have a manifold system depending on where the treatment area is, where the end customer is. So it could come from west, could come from south. It just depends on where in the county we'd have the availability. Yep. So it doesn't have to necessarily go through west. We might have some excess capacity in the south since some of the growth is there right now. Right now, we're doing about 800,000 gallons. The plant's rated at 2 million gallons. We certainly have some room to take on some additional flow and move that water elsewhere.
Okay. Because I think what I'd like to do is, I talked to Kate about this, and we're gonna wait till after the governor's elections, which I think now means we might wait till next year. But to sit down with St. John's and DEP and try to resolve that issue, you know, and say, hey, you guys need to give us a little flexibility here, because we're trying to do the right thing by getting septic tanks off sewer and utilize this, but you know, I'm hopeful that if we can sit down with St. John's and DEP and say, you know, how can we work this out to make it, you know, feasible to do, and not just, you know, require a subdivision to devote, you know, half their site plan for a separate pond. So, but we'll try to work on that and get back with that. So,
And that's what I had mentioned earlier, sorry, that there's substitution credits or offset credits, so that if we were to provide, say, 100,000 gallons of reuse in lieu of groundwater, that we would be able to somehow enter into some sort of agreement with said property or development and be able to offset their consumptive use permit, because we are giving them some of that reuse as we look at ways to reduce our demand on the UFA.
and wouldn't we be able to do that with a lot of landowners? Aren't there a lot of farms and ranches out there that have the CPUs? So we're not just limited to one landowner?
We're not limited to one landowner.
Okay. Commissioners, anything else for staff? Commissioner Zork?
Any ideas of what the cost per 1,000 gallons might remotely be? Because these farmer guys and cattle folks have free water, other than they have to pull it out. And if they could pull out 100,000 gallons for free, and we're gonna tell them for 100,000 gallons, it's, I don't know, $400 or some number, that's not gonna be too appealing for them to convert.
I would say it's more than 21 cents and less than 2.20 so, per 1,000 gallons. It would be somewhere in that range. I think that in some cases, the pressurized system, because of the additional pumping, because of the pressurized flow, because of the additional breaks and leaks that occur, you would have to have a higher rate to sustain some of the
Right.
costs associated with it. Yeah. That's not something we looked at yet, because it's all dependent on the capital costs associated with building that infrastructure and then your carrying cost to maintain it. Yeah.
Right.
I just, along those lines, and I think that, you know, the aquifer water comes from north to south, and there's a lot more growth north of us putting straws in the ground, and the water here, from my understanding, is getting more and more with the solids in it and the chlorides and things like that. So I think at some point, while they may be able to pull that water up free, it may not be very good water, and that they're going to need, I think, an alternate water at some point in the future. So I still think this is good planning. I think it's good being proactive and at least getting the information to have our options available to us. So, all right, Commissioners, the staff does have a couple recommendations here.
Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to move staff recommendations with the one addition to trying to find out what neighborhoods might use more irrigation water.
Second. We have a motion from Commissioner Solari, second by Commissioner Flesher, for the two recommendations. And Dylan, you have the addition from Commissioner Solari?
basically just do some more research on which neighborhoods would.
Utilize potable water for irrigation, yep, okay.
Where they need 'em.
Is there anyone in the public that wishes to comment on the motion before us?
Bless you.
Good afternoon.
Joseph Paladin, President of Black Swan Consultant. Just a point of information to Vinnie. As far as a local county that's using, it's hooked up with reuse water, St. Lucie County. As a matter of fact, all of St. Lucie West is working on reuse water system. This is a point of information.
Thank you. Anyone else from the public? Seeing none, all those in favor signify with aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries 5-0. Utility Services, item G4, the Comprehensive Water, Wastewater, and Reclaimed Water Rate Study and Water and Sewer Impact Fee Study recommendations. Again, Mr. Burke, welcome.
All right, thank you again. Vincent Burke, Director of Utility Services. To my right is Cindy Corrente, Utility Finance Manager. So for anything that I mess up or don't get right, she's going to kick me in and take over. But it's a long-awaited update back to the board. We came back in October. There was some discussion with respect to some of the staff recommendations, and this is our homework assignment and our report back to the Board of County Commissioners. So you may recall that we have shown on the left-hand portion of the screen the existing rate structure that's in 4 different volumetric charge blocks: the 0 to 3,000, 3,001 to 7, 7,001 to 13, and over 13,000. We broke out the sewer on the bottom and the water at the top portion of the screen. Staff had come back with bringing that to 3 blocks, but based on board direction, we were asked to investigate maybe 4 blocks, but also to look at incentivizing those folks that are actually water conservation stewards, to reward those folks for using less water, but also on the other side to discourage high users. And so we tried to look at scenario 2 and look at scenario 3. Specifically, we're going to focus on scenario 3 because staff has put some effort into the 4-tiered system with respect to the low rates for the first 0 to 4,000 and then 4,001 to 7,000. So it's a 220 rate and then 257. If you get over the 7,000 to 12,000, it jumps up quite a bit to $4.95, and then over 12,000 to $9.75. We have no recommendations for the sewer bill to remain the same. So what does this mean? We tried to at least look at what the actual cost to a customer would be with respect to the existing current rate that's on the left-hand portion of the screen, whether or not they're at 3,000, 5,000, or up to 15,000. And we also broke out what it would be for scenario 1, 2, and 3. Again, scenario 1 was what the staff had initially proposed for the 3 different blocks. Scenario 3, you can see, is on the right-hand side. So for those folks that are using water judiciously or very sparingly, the actual rates will go down. So you'll have some winners and some losers with scenario 3. Those folks that are 0 to 4 or 4 to 7,000 will actually see their bills decrease. It's those folks that are using water over 8,000 gallons that will actually see a modest increase in their bill. We have the description compared for current and scenario 3, not only for the single family, which is a large portion of our customer base, but also the mobile home and multifamily. And then we just did a commercial assuming they had 3 ERUs to look at the cost difference between what they're paying today versus what they may pay with the proposed scenario 3 with that higher rate structure. From a percentage standpoint, we illustrate the volumetric levels on the left-hand portion of the screen, looking at the 3 different scenarios. You can see again on the first 7,000 or so gallons, you'll see a slight modest decrease, but then you'll see it jumps up quite a bit for those folks that are using water in the higher tier. And in some cases, if you're using 20,000, it's going to be a large increase. We have initially metered multifamily mobile homes to show the difference as well. It kind of follows the single-family home chart that I just showed previously. And then we also did it for some of the commercial rate structures, looking at single ERUs or multiple ERUs in terms of the percentage difference between what they are paying currently and what they may be paying. So kind of a busy slide, but we wanted to illustrate some of the potential scenario changes with respect to the higher rates, depending on if you're using a little bit or multiple gallons of water. So here's the percentage. We put this in the backup as well. Again, a majority of the accounts that we have are single family, 86% of all the accounts. We broke out the usage in terms of the likelihood of what's happened. This is again for a year period of time for the billing that we had analyzed. And you can see that majority, not all, but a majority of the usage is in the first 2 or 3 tiers of the 80% of the accounts. You'll have a few in the higher tiers and then about 3%, 12,000 or more. We did the same analysis for the mobile home and the multifamily accounts, which account for 9% of all the accounts. You can see a high majority are going to be in the 0 to 4,000 tier, and then the commercial is the remaining 5%. So these again are just the water billing accounts where you can see the percentage of the likelihood of all of the different volumetric levels on the left-hand side, the number of events, the cumulative totals, and this is a 472,000 billing events for the accounts that we have, and then the percentage is a checksum to make sure that everything is consistent. We did the same thing not only for the single family, but for the individually metered multifamily and the mobile home units. Again, you have a very small percentage of the billing frequency when you're at or above 8,000 in less than 1/10 of 1%. And the water events for the commercial structure as well. So if you look at the comparison from a revenue standpoint, staff initially had a revenue neutral, about revenue neutral. If you look at the bottom line here, comparison between the existing block structure that's in place since 1999 versus the calculated scenario 1, it's just over 15 million. Scenario 3, with the higher allocation above 8,000 and above 12,000, looks at a difference of about $1 million between the current bills versus what's proposed for scenario number 3. We looked at the pro forma based on some of the board input in terms of some of the R&R transfers that had initially been suggested. Those have now gone away with respect to the additional dollars that are coming from the rate, and we're not going to be pulling some R&R transfers in order to cover some of those costs. So this is not in the backup report, but should the board choose to direct staff to look at a different scenario, we would go back to our rate consultants and update the material accordingly. This is just for illustration purposes that those lines are no longer going to be allocated to pull money out of the reserve fund for the R&R transfers. This is the pro forma. This was, again, in the backup, but has been updated. If you look at the bottom two, you'll note that the required debt service coverage is about 1.2, and we can see that Indian River County is pretty strong with respect to the debt service coverage, not only in the proposed 18-19 year, but also for a few years out based on some of the allocations that are being recommended. So we talked about the fundamental rate modifications. We're eliminating the billing charge as a separate line item, combining that and actually reducing it for the proposed rate. We looked at the service availability for multifamily homes as well as for the sewer to be combined into one line item. This may or may not be significant, but we have a very limited amount of data on our bill, and so times when we have things like no fat, oil, and grease, or we have messages to our customers, it would allow us to then add additional information with respect to stuff that's on the water bill. Here is the fundamental rate modification that we had illustrated in terms of what was on the, I'm not sure why that did not come up, I'm sorry. I apologize, I was supposed to have this proposed rate come through, so I'm not sure why that did not come through. We tried to illustrate the current rate. It's shown on your attachment, I believe, on appendix attachment number 6. We tried to illustrate at least what the current rate is, what the consultant calculated rate is based on Schedule 8 of the rate study. We looked at salaries and benefits and time and cost for us to go out there. We calculated a much higher rate with respect to some of the fees that were in service today, and then we've come up with a proposed rate. A majority of the proposed rates are unchanged since 1999. We just wanted, for illustration purposes, to show the difference between the two. Again, it was on attachment number 6 under miscellaneous charges and the fundamental rate modifications, attachment 5. Yes, thank you, Cindy. So again, we talked about the INI. The consultant had mentioned the fact that there are cases where we have storm drains that are tied into our sewer system. It causes increased demand, so we have a modified INI surcharge that's going to be added. Here's our current rate on the left-hand side, and here's the proposed rate, so that when we have large rain events, precipitation that causes increased demand in our systems, the likelihood of sanitary sewer overflows grows when we're actually pumping not only domestic wastewater, but also rainwater and or standing surface water that enters into our system. And so we are constantly fighting with, the INI and the precipitation, especially for some of the older systems where some of the lines are not as solid as they should be that are
Mr.
private.
Chairman, can I ask a
Commissioner Zork.
question on that? We had talked about these last time where you're getting a lot of that line leakage intake because of the older systems. So we can't use the master water meter into these projects as an indicator. Can we use the lift station flow calculation out, or how would you know that there's a spread between consumption and return to the plant?
Exactly that. In some cases, we have the master meter. In other cases, we have distributed meters that we'd have to sum total. That's a little more time intensive, but in the cases where we have a master meter, we do just that. We have a calibrated sanitary sewer meter in place to look at what's actually going downstream into our system versus what's coming in. A lot of times the delta, you can literally set your time to it in the June, July months, August months when we have those heavy rain events. Yep.
And just remember, when we do change this, to send it to everybody that's on the ownership list of those parks, because they will say, we didn't know, as the battles from the years past on the water side, that we want them to say, no, I'd like to say, we clearly notified you, you guys need to spend some maintenance dollars. These aren't just unlimited cash machines. You got to put some money back into the infrastructure on these things, and that's great. Thank you.
Good comments. We have some of the miscellaneous charges shown on the left-hand side, the current rate. The biggest difference, which we'd illustrated before, was the water service connection. It has been $400 for a long time. We have the calculated rate based on staff's data, again shown in Schedule 8 of the rate study. That includes things like taps, perhaps some directional bore, being able to come under roadways to be able to service somebody on the property. We had been losing some money and not being able to cover our cost in order to be able to provide services. So we're trying to make sure that the costs that we have today are up to date based on actual costs that we incur. This is just a continuation of the miscellaneous charges. We propose no changes for the meter install, which you can see is exactly the same. There are some line extensions fees that we have illustrated. The water deposit has gone disconnect from $25. It's a calculated consultant rate of $182, but staff felt that would be unnecessarily financial onus, so we're recommending a proposed rate of $70, which also includes the reconnect, as well as the customer requested disconnect or reconnect going from $25 up to $75. Additional miscellaneous charges, general service calls. Certainly doesn't cover the fuel cost, the time and benefits for someone to go out there for after hours or even during hours. And so we have a proposed $75, $95 rate respectively during hours or after hours. We had noted that the calculated rate was $122, and we had initially proposed $122 plus 25% for the service call after hours, but staff is recommending a more modest $95 just to cover some of the costs associated with doing those services. No changes on the plans review. We do have site plan for utility construction permits, $150, and we're maintaining that $150 as the proposed rate as well. We had briefly talked about the impact fees. The current rate is $1,300 per water ERU, $27.96 per sewer ERU. The consultant had calculated a much higher rate with respect to the water and sewer ERUs, but staff is recommending we maintain the proposed water and sewer ERU rates at this time. So the recommendations, which are listed in the agenda item as well, is the implement changes, which would go into effect March 1st, 2019. We had talked previously when we came to the board of updating for more accurate consumption to read in the hundreds of gallons versus thousands of gallons. That's something that many utilities are going to capture some of those costs, so we're not incurring costs that may or may not be in a certain tier. That would realistically add to a more accurate bill for the customer. Staff is recommending to adopt rate scenario 3 that has the conservation one for the lower tiered users versus the higher rates for some of those higher users. We are recommending to adopt the rates and fees as depicted in attachment 5, which is included in the backup. That's the fundamental rate modifications. Adopt the miscellaneous charges as reflected on attachment 6, and to keep the impact fees the same as staff recommended in attachment 7. And last but not least, staff has asked for board permission to come to the board each and every year to do a prior year analysis of the consumer price index, contingent upon BCC approval each and every year. So we would propose to look at the April to April last year CPI to include any proposed modifications in the upcoming budget that is done through the summertime, so that there would certainly have to be some documentation justification, but certainly looking for staff approval to be able to do that each and every year. Thank you.
Thank you, Vinny, and you must have done a good job because Cindy didn't have to jump in and correct you on anything. So, Commissioners, any questions of staff on the presentation?
Wendy wrote it.
Vinny, I got two things, and can you keep that last list of the recommendations up, please? Just so, Vinny, I've talked to you a little bit. You know, our system is growing. We did, what, 200 and something new connections just last month? And I know that, you know, we've been coming out of the recession and all this, and I know that your staff is working very hard and everybody's really busting their rear ends. And we talked about, you know, the things that you might need for the utility system to really make sure we stay ahead of things and be proactive and have enough staff. So are you confident with the rates you all and what you're proposing here today that that's going to give you the resources you need to keep our utility system top notch and account for a growing system?
I am, but I have to warn you that the big three we look at are electric, salaries and benefits, and chemicals. And so each year those tend to continue to go up, even though we go out for bid and we try to source them at all possible, and we're on FPL for some but not all of our stuff. Those are the big three items, and so we've seen a steady increase, and we've fortunately been able to cover our costs by the account growth. But right now, as you can see, based on the last agenda item from Public Works, the cost of doing business with material and labor has continued to go up, so we need to make sure we stay on top of that. And I think if we can come to the board for a CPI increase, that would allow us the flexibility to cover those increased costs and to hopefully cover any additional staff that we need, because the level of service that's expected of us in this utility is continuing to grow. And with the regulatory environment and with the current staffing, we need to continue to grow as the county grows to be able to service all of our customers in a timely fashion. So.
And that was my second thing on the CPI index, Commissioners. I would like to see that more as a automatic CPI index unless the board votes not to implement it each year. And I don't know how the rest of the commissioners feel, but I think to me it makes more sense to go ahead and factor that in unless we make the decision not to. And I think that'll help keep our system ahead of the cost of inflation. As Vinny just said, you've got all your operating costs going up, your chemical costs going up, wages going up, and I just think we need to have an allowance in there to make sure that we are keeping up with those additional costs. So just throw that out there for any discussion.
I would agree with that statement.
Okay. Any, Commissioner Fleischer, okay. Commissioner Zork?
In looking from 1999 today, we didn't have a CPI index, and we managed to keep our cost, and I know we pay our folks a lot better today, and benefits are a lot more expensive today. So somehow, through good leadership and you guys doing a great job, we managed to keep that. When something's automatic, over time, and when new people come in, I don't know if as long as we can instill the same philosophy of squeezing every penny like our predecessors have done, that would work. We also were able to pay off debt a bit ahead of schedule without a CPI increase in the rates from 1999. So it'd be nice to have, but I don't know if I want to do it as an automatic. But I think we would visit it, look at our fund balances, look at our account growth, and see, are we on track? Are we seeing that we need more funding or not?
Okay.
Yeah, on that-
Commissioner Solari?
On that one, I'm probably closer to Commissioner Zork. I certainly wouldn't be hard against the increase, but I think it's a good discipline to come before the board and just explain why each year during the budgetary process. And I think most of us would understand if it's necessary, but there are additional revenue streams that are greater revenue streams that they're getting now than before. And as the system gets larger, the economy of scales benefits the system. So I would probably, both for myself and for the public, think it would be better if we let the public know why it was happening. You know, that it's easy enough to say there are three things. You know, salaries went up 3%, chemicals went up 4%. What was the third thing? I feel like Rick Perry.
Electric.
Electric's going down 20%, so are you gonna reduce rates
Well,
next year?
well, I've got to caution, almost all of our electric in utilities is FPL.
Oh, okay, but I mean,
There's a few lift stations on City of Vero, but all of the water plants and wastewater plants are already FPL, so we don't have that gain there. Not here. We do elsewhere in the county, but not in utilities.
so in any event, I just think it'd be a better discipline to have them come before us and let not us, only us, but the citizens know why the increase is coming.
We'll handle that here in a minute then. And then Vinny, the last thing is we talked about the next kind of rate evaluation where I think we're in the 3 or 5 year. Do you all have a recommendation for that?
Yeah, we would recommend coming back in and around year 2024. Basically, that's when some of the debt service would be paid off. So if you're thinking 5 years from 2019, since this would go into effect March 19th, that would be our recommendation.
Okay.
Not wait 20 years.
Right, yeah, I'm good with that, so. Commissioners, any other comments? Jason?
Yeah, I just want to add on the CPI, maybe not necessarily an automatic situation, but I want to make sure we don't fall into what happened 19 years ago. We had the ability to have CPI adjustments from the rate study in 1999, and we just never did it. And we've been fortunate to be able to go 19 years and not need a rate increase. But I will say the era of inexpensive water is kind of over. Our regulatory framework on the water and the wastewater side is definitely tightening. Whereas perhaps not automatic, but I think we need to definitely make sure that we're bringing that CPI adjustment back and considering that, and not have it to where the default is no, that we just never do it. I'm cautious. I want to caution against just not making that CPI adjustment, because we're not going to be able to go another 19 years without a rate increase, I don't think.
So are you afraid that if staff came before us and made the argument that we would say no?
No, I just want to make sure that everyone's expecting that we come back with a CPI decision each year. We're likely to recommend that in many of those years. I just want to not run into a scenario where we never bring back a CPI increase for consideration.
Well, maybe former utility directors have been shy in the past, but I haven't seen Vinny be too shy in too many things, so.
I just want to caution that, our goal is to keep our rates low, and we think we've shown that over the years, and we've done a good job of that. We just want to make sure that we're realistic, because what you have happen in some places is there's no CPI adjustment, and then you get 5 years down the road, and then you're staring at a 15% rate increase that's needed or something like that. So when you hold off on those decisions, then it becomes challenging to catch up in the event that these CPIs are needed and not implemented.
Commissioner Adams?
So I actually have experience with CPI adjustment on a yearly basis at the city of Fellsmere. It was something that we would do in our budget process. The water department would base their budget on the CPI increase, and then it would ultimately come to the council for final approval. So they kind of got a jump start on being able to budget, but then if we decided that wasn't something we wanted to do, and they would have to justify it and base it on something, it was ultimately the council's decision. I would envision something similar to that. I think that it's just a good tool to be able to use, but I will also say it's not the be-all and end-all of planning, because, again, while they have done a CPI increase on a pretty regular basis at the city of Ellesmere, they just had a rate study and had to drastically increase the water rates. But I think the one thing it does do, it allows us to have a little bit more discussion on a regular basis about what the rates are and what's going on and what's impacting them. So that's one of the reasons why I like having that as a tool. But again, I mean, I understand it shouldn't necessarily be automatic, but if we can give them the ability to use it to craft the budget, and then we have to ultimately approve it like anything else, I think it's a good tool for the department and for us to be able to have those conversations.
The way you described it is pretty much what I would have thought if we were looking at it annually.
Okay. Anyone else? Commissioner Zork?
One other question, Vinny, when you went back, so we don't have a change in the sewer or water impact fees, but we have some connection charges, wet taps or jack and board type charges. How many days' notice is required on the contract impairment clause on the change of fees if a contractor has a project under contract and they've based it on fee schedule 1, but they may not have a closing till, I don't know, some other date? There was a notification period when this came up about 10 years ago, that there was a notice period the county had to put, these are the new rates to change. If you have a contract, you need to get your ducks in order or collect the higher rate if you're not going to be in the door and paid before an effective date. But there was so we have an effective date of March 1st, which is pretty far out, but I don't remember what was the number of days with that.
I know for impact fees, there's something in statutes that says you have to do a certain amount of time. I can't recall what that day is. It's 90 or 180 or something like that. But as far as contract impairment, I'd have to defer to the attorney. I think we're out there March 1st.
That's pretty good. We just have to do some
almost 5 months.
communication tool to get this out so people don't have that surprise that there's a change on some of the related fees, not the impact fee, but the associated fees in some cases.
Okay. Commissioner Solari?
Hey, Mr. Chairman. Vinny, could you put up the adopt rate scenario 3, please?
The revenue, or would you like to?
That one is, so it's the 975 and not the 984?
It is the
975.
975.
I was just wondering why we'd go for that one rather than the 984.
I think there was some differentiation between the 7,000 and 8,000 that we wanted to capture,
And that's where you got it.
yeah, there was a slight increase for that. So we had, if you will, tweaked to be a hybrid of what we had, even though it's 0 to 4, versus the cap at 7,000 and anything over that for 7,001 plus for the third tier. So I think there was some number crunching that was done to make sure that we were not inadvertently penalizing somebody at the lower tier, to make sure that we could save them some money for the first 2 tiers.
Yeah, that part I understand. I can be good with the 975, but I'll be the first to say that if anything, it's too low, especially for conservation water. And can you put the Elmo on?
Yep.
I just took some of the numbers
Next slide.
based on the old scenario 3, which had the 984 and the 492 for the 12,000 gallons. Because it looks like it's a big increase if you look at the 12,000 gallons or above 12,000 gallons at 984. But I did a bill by hand for 300 gallons for somebody who's what I think is probably somebody with no irrigation system in a small house and using most of the water for simply in-the-house use. And they come up paying, if they use 3,000 gallons, $5.12 a gallon with the water charge per thousand and the base facility charge. And somebody, it turned out, I just picked 15,000 as a number, not knowing how the calculation would work, but with the base facility charge and the charges for 1,000 gallons of use for after 15,000 gallons, they end up still paying a penny less per 1,000 gallons on the entire bill. So it's not a huge, really, increase, all in all. There's a little bigger increase evidently, as Vinnie pointed out to me, when you add the 6% tax on top of that. But I think that the water bills for water are still very, very reasonable. And one thing to keep in mind is we're keeping the impact fees down. And one of the things that drives the impact fees up is the necessary capacity, which on the margin is driven by the irrigation use. So basically water hogs are basically driving the amount of capacity that's needed and then driving the impact fees up. So I'm more and more comfortable with a higher water conservation charge for those people using 12,000 gallons or more. So that's just my point.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Vinnie.
Any other questions or comments of Vinnie? So Vinnie, if you could just, again, put the last recommendation slide up, please. So, Commissioners, what we have there is 7 recommendations. I'd like to take the first 6 as one motion, and then, because I think we've had a little bit of difference of opinion on the last one, we'll just take that as a separate motion. So would someone like to make a motion for the first 6 staff recommendations?
Mr. Chairman, I'll be happy to make that motion for items 1 through 6 on the staff recommendation.
Thank you. And
Second.
there's a second by Commissioner Slurry. So motion by Commissioner Flesher, second by Commissioner Slurry. Is there anyone in the public that wishes to comment on the motion before us?
To the chair, if I may.
yes.
Was there some, no. There's no one approaching. I know there was also some discussion about bringing an evaluation back in 2024. Would you like that as part of this motion, or do you want that as part of a separate item, or is that just sort of consensus?
It was recommended in the rate study, but certainly could be part of the recommendation, maybe.
Okay. Why don't we just do that as a separate motion at the end? We'll do that. So we'll stick with just the first 6 staff recommendations that we see on the slide today, right now. Anyone from the public that wishes to comment on the motion before us? Seeing none, all those in favor signify with aye. 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 Any opposed? That motion carries 5-0. And then the item on the annual consumer price index, the only concern I have is I don't want that to become a political issue. And every 2 years we have an election, and somebody might be running on no new taxes. So then, you know, you're not going to get a vote for a CPI, because that would be considered a tax increase. And I just think politically, it's going to be easier to, you know, vote down the index than it is to vote it up.
I'd be happy to do it every other year and do it on the non-election years. So it's, you know, it's automatic when there's an election coming up. And then the next year, it comes before us in this fashion that Commissioner Adams mentioned.
Well,
I don't mind doing it yearly,
Yeah.
I'd kind of like,
although thank you, Bob, for,
well, quite frankly, I'm not offended by what Commissioner Adams has suggested, because it makes great sense in order for staff to be able to earmark and plan with an intended increase. And at that point, if we do not have the funding, or if the funding is not available, then we can vote it down if we have to.
And, you know, Commissioner Slay, I'm just thinking about you here, because
Yeah.
if the index increases in there, and you're in the running for another Miser of the Year award, this would allow you to vote it down. I mean, then you're the hero.
Got to be
No,
worth
put
3
Dodger
points on the evaluation. Maybe 4.
I'll tell you,
Spreadsheet.
actually,
You just stick with me, Commissioner. You're going to go places.
yeah, that's what I'm afraid of.
I don't think he wants to go where you want him to go.
Well, let me try this. Is there someone willing to make a motion to make the consumer price index an annual increase contingent upon the board not voting it down?
I'm confused. I feel like there's like 7 different conversations, and I'm kind of unclear, because it's I feel like we're having the same conversation. We want to do the same thing. Is the difference just, Bob, you want to be able to vote to approve it, and Peter, you want to be able to vote to not approve it? Is
Correct.
that-
I want the CPI to be factored in every year, unless the board votes not to have a CPI increase.
And
So annually,
don't
we'll
care
be
if it
able
comes-
to vote it down
Every year, we would have the option to vote it down, correct?
in a timely fashion for staff to be able to.
Staff would bring it before the.
Budget
your
and,
Scenario, still, we would bring it before the board. It wouldn't just be, we do a CPI and don't.
Oh, no,
touch
no,
it,
the
but
board,
we
the
still
board
have to
would,
bring the
would
bo-
still have the option to vote it down, correct?
Okay, so,
that makes great sense.
so,
I'm missing I'm just,
So would it be an informational item every year? And then at that point, if it catches the eye of a commissioner, they would then say, well, wait a minute, no,
this is how I would imagine it happening. Just bear with me, because I would imagine it happening as it's going to happen yearly and be factored into the budget. And then we, at some point, have to approve the rates. And that's when we would approve the CPI moving forward.
and if we just look at the sheet right there, it says March 1st, these go into effect. So the budget's done, it's in the budget's approved, but the rates are effective March 1st. So the first meeting in January to get past the elections, it comes before the board, where we either say yes or no, depending upon which way we go here. I'm still confused on that one. But it comes before us at a public meeting where we can let the citizens get the information about what and why, what the rate's gonna be and why we're raising it, which I think is an easy enough thing.
On what day do you?
Point of clarification. So we are asking for board to approve the tier rate scenario 3 to go into effect March 1st. The CPI that I anticipated, or when we anticipated, staff anticipated, would be something that we'd reach for it from April to April each year, that would be included in the summer budget packet, preliminary budget packet, that would then go into effect October 1 of the following year. So any potential CPI increase would be for fiscal year 1920, if it got approved. What we could do is bring something, say May, and say, hey, here's the CPI. Could we move forward to include it in the budget as one option? Or
Maybe.
if we include it in the budget,
I like your first one. Let's go
Yeah.
with that. That's the motion I make. It will be included, the CPI will be included in the budget package in the summer and will go into effect with the approved budget. If nobody wants to approve it, then you just have to rework that part of it as a normal budget process.
So it's in staff content. It's gonna come before us.
so it would be.
But if it's just left in the budget with not coming before any meeting, then there's not gonna be any real discussion about it. And the customers are probably not gonna have a good idea that their bill at October 1st is gonna go up 3%, and won't have a good idea of why it went up 3%.
Can we have a discussion about it, Jason, through the budget process? I mean, don't we discuss rates and stuff?
Right, we could have that as part of the, just like we consider the street lighting districts and
Right.
the tax rates, we could say the CPI for this year is 2.5%. We're recommending the 2.5% increase to the rates and get the board to provide direction on that.
Will that work? Will that be somewhat easy, or? Okay. That's my motion.
I'll second that. So Jason, then the CPI will be factored into the budget that utilities will bring to us in our July workshop. And that'll be one of your budget message bullet points. And then the board can decide then, as we have made other changes, whether we do not want to apply the CPI for that year. Everybody got it? Does the clerk have that? Dylan, do you and the clerk, you're all good?
The motion was by Adam, second by O'Brien, essentially is the CPI increase would be factored into the budget presented to the board.
Okay.
And then the board could then vote it out if that was the wishes of the board. And it would be essentially a separate discussed item as part of the budget process.
At the budget workshops.
Budget workshop in July, right.
Because I want to make sure we've got the time to get it implemented, and if we wait until the hearing, then we run short for an October 1.
That's not fair.
So at the budget workshops.
Yep, okay.
It'll become political when it gets voted down. Either way.
Is there any further discussion among the commissioners?
Please no.
Is there anyone from the public that wishes to comment on the motion before us? Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion signify with aye. Aye. Those opposed? I did not hear any opposed, so the motion passes 5-0.
Quick, move on.
Yeah. Next. Vinny, are you okay? You're looking a little. Right, okay. Commissioners, do we want to just have a quick motion to have a rate study update in 2024?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion that we go forward with a rate study for 2024.
Discussion.
We have a motion from Commissioner Flesher, second by Commissioner Adams. Under discussion, Commissioner Slory.
Okay, on this one, I think the motion should be that the staff comes before us to make a recommendation one way or another at the end of the 5-year period. Not that we automatically just have a rate study after 5 years, because it may be that this goes along like it did the last 20 years, and the annual financials show that the utility is in good shape, and the value just isn't there to have one. I would at least like a discussion on why it needs to be done and what's going to be in it every 5 years before it's just automatically okayed.
So you want them to do a rate review prior to
No, not a rate review.
triggering?
A staff report to say,
rate
you know,
review.
why it's recommended at this time to have the full review.
You want an agenda item to come to kind of give us an intro and why we may or may not need to do a rate study and then decide at that point
Exactly,
in 2024?
exactly.
Okay, I'm fine with that.
I'm good with that. Would you like to?
Yes, let's amend that motion, Mr. Chairman.
So the motion will be that the staff will come back to the board with a recommendation of whether to not have a rate study in early 2024. Good for everybody? And the clerk, Dylan, everybody's got that? Okay, great. And that was by Commissioner Fletcher and second by Commissioner Adam. Any further discussion? Is there anyone from the public that wishes to comment on the motion before us? Seeing none, all those in favor signify with aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion also carries 5-0. Next item is the uniform septic to sewer policy. This is also deferred from the November 6th meeting. And again, Mr. Burke.
All right, thank you. The consultant did touch on the septic to sewer policy briefly, but we'll review some of the information and hopefully outline a couple options. Just a quick history. In 2016, the board directed staff to evaluate a countywide septic to sewer program. There are 4 phases. Look at the priority ranking, look at the comprehensive plan with community development, look at some financing operations and public outreach, and encumber the fund's implementation of the priority ranking plan. So on October 18th to 2016, we did the priority ranking, phase 1. In the summer of 2017, we provided the results of the comprehensive priority ranking, and then the BCC authorized Raftellus to start phase 3, which is the rate study, which we were just talked about. And then we incorporated some of the changes to the comprehensive plan in the summer of 2018 in the sanitary sewer sub-element phase 2, with comments from planning and zoning incorporated into the comp plan. This is a map that you're probably familiar with, looking at the septic tanks and the high density in certain parts of the county with respect to about 30,000 or so septic tanks in New River County. This is the top 30 final ranking from the comprehensive study. You may recall that we had an initial ranking, but then we also took a look at the cost per pound or the pound removed per year in terms of some of the total nitrogen, and then re-ranked those in the colored ranking system here. So we actually have in this year the design of Florvan Shore subdivision to move forward based on the final ranking of number 1 in our top listing. So the current project's familiar with North Sebastian Septic to Sewer Phase 1, which is substantially complete. We're wrapping up some of the final work up in that area. That's inside the unincorporated and parts of the city of Sebastian. We are looking to finalize the Septic to Sewer Phase 2. That looks at most of the residential portions west of US 1 and Ursel Dune Heights. And also, I just mentioned, we're looking at the Florvan subdivision due to its high ranking. We just wanted to do a quick table here to show a hypothetical construction cost of $1 million with 50 benefiting properties. and looking at some of the potential funding sources. I know the Planning and Zoning Commission had wanted something a little more solid with respect to staff going after some funding, which we have done in the past and will continue to do so. We just wanted to run through these real quick. On the left-hand side is the potential funding source, some of the amounts that would be available, and some of the comments. So St. John's River Water Management District, potentially up to 33% of the construction cost. We were able to secure funding for the West Wabasso Phase 2. That went out for bid last Sunday, the 11th. So we hope to get some prices and be back to the board here shortly once we get those bids received. We did try to do some state appropriation dollars and working with our legislative folks to try to allocate some monies. We have not been successful in the past, but certainly we're going to continue to try to do so. We did go after some Indian River Lagoon NEP dollars. We were able to fund some of that for the West Wabasso. We've done some CDBG solicitation in the past. Those funding amounts are capped, at least for the neighborhood revitalization project, at $750,000. And note that CDBG funding is only available for communities that are financially disadvantaged for low to very low, moderate income, based on some salary criteria for owner-occupied homes. We have gone off to some FDP state-funded grant agreements. We were successful in getting some, thanks to Kay Cotner and the Attorney's Office for helping to get that project ranked and submitted. And that's also going to be used to offset the cost for some of the benefiting property owners in the West Wabasso Phase 2 project. Benefiting properties, in some cases, certainly we're looking to have some of those folks pay to offset the capital costs. And then we have optional sales tax. The county has set aside 20% for lagoon projects. So some possible funding amounts. Notice that they may exceed the allowable here, but we wanted to at least illustrate some of the potential funding agencies that have been used in the past and will continue to be solicited to try to reduce and make the project as financially feasible for the benefiting property owners. There's some state revolving funds out there to borrow those costs, but note that the financing rates, while very attractive, are contingent upon certain connection criteria. Again, those are for, say, some small utilities that may not have good fund balance that can go out to solicit some dollars, get those monies, but are pledged revenues for those folks that would be benefiting from the system. So moving forward, the county goes obviously to protect the lagoon since it is deemed to be impaired by the FDEP from 2013. We want to make sure that we keep our stakeholders informed of this process. Public education is key. I think it's critical to not only make sure that they're aware of what's coming, but also to provide some options with respect to financing and some of the reasons why this is such a priority. We obviously want to provide safe, reliable water and wastewater services to our customers. We're going to pursue some of the grant dollars to minimize overall impact to ratepayers and be fair to the county citizens. And we want to make sure that we move forward to implement the countywide ranking and the septic to sewer connection policy. So we had put together some of the recommendations and outlined some of the funding agencies with a little bit more information on the agenda packets. We illustrated some of the costs associated with it, but we wanted to just kind of summarize what the consultant had talked about before, certainly open it up for discussion, but I'll just run through the recommendations. One is to require those benefiting property owners to pay a minimum of 20% of the project costs. That may change based on the availability of grants and the success of this department to be able to solicit and obtain those grants. Note that there's finite dollars available, and sometimes it's a very, very competitive process to go after those grants. We're going to solicit alternative funding options that was mentioned in the comp plan, which will include various grants to cover the remaining project costs. Use optional sales tax dollars as needed, not to exceed 25% of the project cost. Establish a septic to sewer financing interest rate. And we said this is to be the greater of the maximum, either 2% or half of the current BCC approved rate. You recall every January the board approves the rate that we charge our customers for borrowing costs. That current rate is 5%. So hypothetically, if today were the day that we went into effect, it would be about 2.5%. We looked at extending the amortization period from 10 years out to 20-year term. We were asking for board direction to allow us to talk with the Indian River County tax collector to add an annual assessment fee to the property tax bill just as an option. Not to say that that would ultimately be done, but just to look at the cost-benefit analysis of adding a longer term and collection on the tax roll rather than administrator that program through the county utility department in order to assure more consistent reimbursement of cash flow for the project. And then we had suggested a incentive. So this last item is to offer a septic to sewer impact fee credit of 100% for those property owners who commit to connect to the sewer system before the sewer is available to the property. For those property owners that connect within 1 year from service availability, we'd provide a credit of 50% impact fee. And I just want to be clear that that's not a waiver of those fees. It would be, if say, for instance, someone were available, they could apply for some SHIP dollars. But again, the SHIP dollars are for low to very low and moderate income families, so there's specific requirements that property owners would have to fulfill in order to be eligible for those SHIP dollars. So that's one thing. Customers who sign up might be able to be eligible for the offset, and we had proposed an optional sales tax. Although I want to be clear that the impact fee and the construction cost of those optional sales tax dollars as a whole, we're saying should not exceed 25% of the project cost. And again, those customers who delay or wait and sign up after the first year, they would be responsible for the 100% of that impact fee. Not the calculated fee, but the impact fee, that would be $27.96. One of the caveats I also wanted to mention before I stop talking is that with respect to some of the grants out there, and more so the St. John's River Water Management District, is in order to score high on the grant categories, these regulatory agencies are now requiring either a local ordinance or enforceable legal mechanism to make the benefiting property owners connect once that sewer line has been built. So in essence, it would be a mandatory connection policy with respect to the septic to sewer. So if you don't have that policy, or you don't have some sort of enforceable legal mechanism, you will not score as high on the grant request, especially just in one example with the St. John's River Water Management District. So I put something in the agenda period that said that it's now a condition of some of the grants that there is some sort of mandatory connection, and I know that that's been a sore subject in the past, but I just wanted to make the board fully aware that if staff is being asked to go after some of these dollars, then as a condition of some of these grants, there's some sort of mechanism that they're looking for to be part of the application process that would require these folks to say, if you build it, they will connect in order to assure that you have everybody tying into that system. So that's really the summary of the uniform septic sewer policy with the amortization, with the lower impact, the lower percentage rate, and also some of the incentives with respect to the impact fee if someone chooses to sign up before the system's available. And I'm certainly available for any questions that the board may have.
Thank you. Commissioners, question, Commissioner Fleischer?
Yes, thank you. Vinnie, on the last item, does that carry with the property owner or the property? Is it revocable and transferable?
That would stick with the property, regardless of who the property owner is. Yeah, so we'd have to find out a timing mechanism if there is an ownership change, but certainly if somebody comes in, chooses to connect, and then sells the property, say, it would certainly be tied to that property, yeah.
Okay, so it'd be a memorandum of understanding or an agreement that stands with the property.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Commissioner Florida?
I got a few questions. On one, benefiting properties, can you define the benefiting property?
The stick of pipe is running outside that property, typically in the center of the road. Not always, but typically. And that property would have a lateral tied from that main to their edge of property and be eligible to get off their septic tank, abandon their tank, and tie into the centralized system.
Okay, so it requires they have a septic tank. I just wanted to make sure that that's...
No, it would be for any property that could be served, but is currently.
Okay, I'm just wondering if the... To me, that's a problem, if the idea is to get people off septic tanks, then we're giving it a benefit to people who aren't on septic tanks. So it just seems like a tremendous gift that we're giving. So that's just one thought. The second, in that page 3 of the backup, there's a line that says, therefore, the policy shall be to seek 67% funding of the total cost from other sources.
Mhm.
And that seems to be, as I read that, other sources besides the county and the benefiting party.
I'm sorry, where exactly are you at?
It's the third page of the backup that's dated October 29th, about the second full non-indented paragraph, about 2/3 of the way down. This is the paragraph that begins, any alternative funding sources shall be sought, but then down further it goes, therefore, the policy shall be to seek 67% of the funding of the
It's
total
actually
cost,
I'm sorry, it's actually 80%. We had modified that to be 80%
80% from other sources,
from other sources, yes,
but other sources,
including but not limited to appropriations, grant monies, or using
but
obsolete.
it can't be, if other sources are 80%, you've got the benefiting party, which is
20%.
a minimum of 20%, and the optional sales tax of 25%.
I understand you're confusing. It's a little bit confusing, yes. The 25% is a holistic between the impact fees and the construction costs. What we are trying to say is, at least for the construction cost,
Okay, so 25% includes the,
yes, sir.
okay, that I did not get. That's why I'm trying to get some of this clarification.
And there's, yeah, it's clear in the agenda item on the slide itself. It's not that clear
Okay.
that it includes the impact.
That's fine, that's why we were able to ask questions. And the third part is, I have no idea how I am on this quite yet, so I want to get the discussion with my fellow county commissioners. It's the idea of the mandatory connection. Generally, I don't like mandatory requirements and telling them what to do, but here, we're doing something based on public policy and at great cost. And there's some, in my mind, some question of if we don't maximize the possibility of getting grants, why are we having staff chase after all of these grants just to have them shot down because we're not willing to go with the mandatory attachment? So I don't know if the thing to do is to, as we go down the line of that we've already established of communities that may have it, whether we should have a discussion with the community first to see how they feel, to at least see if there's some number that would want it, and say that right now, if 65% or 67% of the people in the community want something, we can have an assessment and everybody has to do it. So I'm not sure if some number and maybe a lower number, I just don't know. But I just can't see us going forward with this without ensuring that a large number of people, if not everybody, will hook up. And I think that we may be spinning our wheels if we have a bunch of grant applications that want the box checked off, but we don't check off the box. And yeah, it seems like we could be setting ourselves up to almost the worst of all worlds. But I think this board has got to make the policy as clear as possible, because we can't put Vinnie back in the situation he was in that benighted community up by the other side of the bridge, where after a citizen came up and asked that the utility department do an analysis of the cost, and after Vinnie nicely went up and announced the cost to the community almost lynched him. So, I think we as a board need to clearly make that decision of whether it's mandatory or not and what the parameters are. So that's my question for the board. I'd be happy to.
In Commissioner, two things. I think it needs to be mandatory. One, because the sooner they hook up, the sooner we get benefits for the lagoon. And then secondly, the sooner they hook up, the more we start generating the rate revenue to help pay for it. At the same time, I believe this is government coming in and saying, we're here to help you. And that we're saying, okay, for the benefit of the lagoon, you're going to have to give up your existing sewer system, which may be working just fine, and go on to the county sewer system. So I think the more, and that benefits everybody. So we're asking them to take on a hit that benefits everybody, because I think we can agree that if the lagoon itself is doing better, the entire county benefits from a healthy, clean lagoon. So I've always felt that the more we can do to cover the cost of the individual, the better off it should be, because we are asking them, you know, they've already paid for a sewer system, you know, when they bought the house or built the septic or whatnot. And now we're telling them you're gonna have to get a second one. So the more we can soften that hit, the better, I think. I kinda like the thing we have now in Sebastian with the 5-year plan, Vinny. And 100% credit if they hook up the first year, then 80, 60, and so on. And I say that because I think maybe a lot of these homeowners, they may need a year or two to kind of save up for their end of it, instead of saying, we're kind of giving them a all or nothing here within the first year, and that might be too much of a financial hit right up front. So I kind of like the 5-year phase in, but at the end of 5 years, they have to be hooked up, or I don't know, through code enforcement or something, we have to fine them or lien them. But so that's just kind of where I am on it. I think we need to be mandatory. But I also want to soften that blow as much as we can, but still get them hooked up with the carrot of the credits, or however we factor that.
And on that portion of it, I think then we also need to announce the communities as soon as possible. So as soon as the process starts to get a grant application, that they're under consideration, and if A, B, and C happens, then this will be happening. So it is a rough period of time in the future. You may be asked to convert and pay an assessment.
Yeah, I think that's a very good idea that we engage them as soon as we can, if we start looking down the road for the next one on the list, so to speak. Commissioner Fleischer.
I had somewhat of the same reservation on the mandatory or compulsory hookup, but I believe that with item 6 intact, I believe a lot of people are going to invoke that. And that's tremendous savings. Plus the fact that with most of the septic to sewers, that they're not actually backhoeing the entire yard at this point. They're emptying and filling in with sand and stabilizing, and it's far less expensive to do that. So coupled with that and the 100% reduction in impact fees, I think I feel a little more comfortable with being a little more aggressive with the plan.
Okay. Commissioner Adams.
So I would agree that I think we can't build out a system if we aren't going to be able to know who and when people are going to hook up. I just don't think that's a good way to go about building infrastructure. So I would agree that there needs to be an expectation of mandatory hookup within a finite period of time. Just, it's only fair to the utilities department. And also, as we try to create a better community. My only concern would be that a lot of the places we're going into, or we'll be doing this in first, are lower income level areas. So provided that we have a good way to help finance some of those costs for those residents, that would be my only concern. But I know that's kind of proposed within this package, so I'm comfortable with it. I think it's really something that we need to be doing anyway, and I know that some of our state legislators are looking for us to kind of do that type of thing if we're going to be coming to them asking for money. So we just kind of need to do it.
Vinny, is there, on the grant applications, do they give any guidance of what they consider, the time frame for mandatory hookup?
No, on one, it was just, again, I'll read verbatim. To score in the high category, the entity must have a developed plan which will be implemented through a local ordinance or enforceable legal mechanism. And the project must be located within a spring shed a quarter mile of the surface water body. That's really the intent of it. So anything that would meet that is being asked to be attached as part of the application process.
So, how we have the last bullet written there, we're going to give them a 50% credit if they connect within the first year of service. Presumably, there'll be 0% credit in year 2. And then do we want to have in our policy mandatory connection within 3 years then? or commissioners?
That sounds feasible. I had just one other question there. What is the trigger on from 100% to 50%? Is that when we see the pipe appear?
So we're looking.
Or is that
Yeah.
funding earmark?
Prior to really the FDEP giving the clearance. So if somebody comes and signs up, the rationale is that they sign up, they are an existing, say, customer on paper, so there's no service availability charge that would come on, but they've committed to be able to connect to the system prior to it being available. But then the threshold, the tipping point is the DEP clearance, where it goes from construction to operation maintenance phase. It's turned over to us, we can operate that and allow flow to be coming through. So it's really tied to that DEP clearance.
And we most certainly would sweeten the pot by making it publicly known when things are coming about on a regular basis.
The sooner you get in, then if you choose to wait, that incentive decreases by half. If the DEP clearance is given, and then say it's a year from that point, you're only gonna be able to get 50% of that coverage. And then if you wait, an additional 24 months after the DEP clearance, then you're gonna pay 100% full freight of that $27.96.
What I'm saying is that I'd like to see that we promote that.
Yep.
And alert the citizens that, it looks like you're gonna have to be able to sign or lose 50% of that option.
And public outreach is key to that, yes. Yep.
Yes.
Commissioner Solari?
I'd like to complicate this just a little bit more.
Why not?
Following up on what Commissioner Adams said about lower income communities, I think on that last point, I'm good with something like Commissioner O'Brien said, where it's 100% for those who sign up ahead of time, probably 75% for the first year, 50% by the second year, and then mandatory by the third year, or even less good than that. But for communities, and I'm not sure what the threshold is, but there are a lot of different thresholds of very low income or low income communities. It's the type of thing you recognize it when you see it, but I think we can get an objective criteria for it. But I'd have something more like 100% for the people who connect to the system beforehand, 90% within the first year, 80% within the second year, 70% in the third year, and by the third year it's mandatory, because they're going to have a hard time paying for it anyway. So I'd hate to, and it's going to take them some time to save up for it anyway, once they know. So the idea that they're going to be able to save a lot of money in 1 year or 2 years is not very realistic. So I'd hate to take away the ability for them to do that.
On that note, with the low and moderately low income, for owner-occupied homes, there will be another source of funding in addition to these incentives that we plan to build into the program, and that would be SHIP funds. And in the past, with our lower income communities where we've brought services, whether it be water or sewer, we have worked very closely with Sasan's staff to assure that everyone that's being affected by that assessment is aware of the availability of SHIP funds if indeed they do qualify. And we actually have worked with Julianne Price and Teddy Floyd in the past to actually pound the pavement and really assure that everybody that's in that community that's eligible is aware of that and has assistance getting the paperwork filled out. So just so you're aware, so when it is a very low or moderately low income, there are some other things in addition to these incentives that we will be working hard to make sure those folks are aware of as well.
Okay, but I just worry about that, and the fact that they're not, they may have a hard time understanding what mandatory is going to be. I mean, I just think of recent examples, Pinson subdivision with the water. You know, we went through great efforts. The utility department did great things to get them that water, and I understand that 2 people signed up. You know, so there's going to have to be, if we go into one of these communities, it's going to have to be a lot of effort with people like Tony Brown and Julian Price and others to let the citizens know what's actually happening. Otherwise, it's going to be there, and they're going to be out of luck. So.
I think, Commissioner, I like your idea of 100% credit pre, 75% credit the first year, 50% credit the second year, and then 0 in mandatory year 3. Is that? I would say we go with that, and then let's hold off on a second set for the lower income stuff, because I think if we go back and look at the priority list, you know, we're thinking about some of the projects we've done, like the West Wabasso, where we did that for other reasons than lagoon priority. And a lot of the lagoon priority, well, there we go. So, you know, a lot of Sebastian Highlands, Hobart Landing, Orchid Island, Ambersand. A lot of those are not your low-income neighborhoods because they're going to be closer to a water body and things like that.
I'm good with that. I just.
So I think we can
wanna bring out
revisit that
now,
if we
though,
need to.
That's gonna be a problem or an issue, or we're gonna have to handle it in a different way when we come to it.
Yeah, okay. Who was that? Jason, did you have something? Or?
I just want to make sure, as a point of clarification, that on these assessment projects, like the water ones that we've done in the past, everyone in a benefiting property, as we talked about, anyone that's in the area that would receive water, or in this case sewer service, pays the assessment whether they connect or not. I mean, we have people that we did assessment projects throughout the Sebastian Highlands in the 90s, and there's still people who have never connected to the water system, but they paid the assessment. So I just want to make sure it's clear. So I appreciate I just want to make sure that's clear, because I'm hearing about saving up for the cost, but if we're given 100% of the impact fee, the only new cost that someone's going to have from hooking up is the impact fee and then the monthly bill. They're going to have the monthly bill. I don't know how you save up for a monthly bill that's going to happen for the rest of all time. But I just want to be clear on that point, that if someone has a hard time saving up for the impact fee, the best thing to do is hook up in year one, so you get the 100% subsidy from the county. Because by delaying to year two, you got to pay something that you wouldn't have had to pay in year one. So I just want to make sure that that's clear.
But that type of education is not gonna be easy to get across. That's,
Right, and I think that's, I want to make sure that's clear, and so that's a great point, that we need to make sure that when we move forward on projects, if we go, and the first one we do, we're going to need to make sure that we provide public information to all of the property owners. I think, to Commissioner Solari's point before, sooner rather than later. Here's what we're looking at, here's what we're proposing doing, and here is the potential impact on all of the people in the area of the project.
So we're, all the commissioners, we're good with the fact that for the construction assessment, it's 100%, everybody pays.
Right.
And we offer the various financing that,
But that's subject to.
We spread it out over 20 years.
the finance, right, and the interest
lower
rate and
rate.
all those, right, okay. So we're all good that
Yes.
the construction assessment is mandatory for everybody. What we're talking about now is the phasing in and carrot and stick for the impact fee credit. Right, okay. Commissioner Zork?
Yes, a couple questions on, if you took the first 4 communities that you had listed on the list, I don't know how many properties that equates out to, but a significant number when you get into Sebastian Highlands Unit 5. And not everybody would do this, but the burn rate of cash, if you're giving away the impact fee on each of those, would be something you couldn't sustain going forward. At least I don't think we could. If everybody said, I'm going to sign up right away to get that impact fee credit, at some point you can't sustain that. And that, I think we briefly talked about that the Sebastian model that on the project we're just finishing, we can't do them all like that because we don't have enough money, I don't think, to go that far. You have any thoughts on that if you give up
That would be a good problem to have, if everybody signed up and we didn't have the
It would.
ability to cover those costs.
But you,
That'd be the problem you want to have, yeah.
well, that's true, but you're taking ERUs out of plant capacity that you're gonna have to build a new plant at a higher cost. That if you give away 1,000 ERUs or 500, that's just a lot of money that's coming out of
Right,
utility fund.
and we're not waiving the impact fees, we're just covering it from a different cost structure, in this case, the optional sales tax. So it would still be used for the transmission and the treatment capacity that would be needed for the additional demand,
Okay.
while we're expanding our reuse system on the other side of the table. But at the end of the day, we want to make sure that, and I think, I don't have the numbers in front of me, don't quote me, but I think the first top 5 or so was about $12 to $14 million we had estimated, based on some general, back of the napkin numbers. So you're looking at trying to solicit and obtain as much of the grant process as possible in order to lower that, to entice all the properties in order to be able to pay, and then maybe amortize those costs over a longer period of time.
And And do we differentiate, I know in the West Wabasso, and that's not always necessarily the perfect example to look at because these are all not West Wabasso scenarios, is there's a number of vacant lots in the West Wabasso that there's nothing there to serve. So I don't think we do anything different for them. They would pay the assessment charge for it going past and the tap being placed in their front yard. At some point, they could connect onto it.
And then 918 says, if you build a structure, and we have
Right, you'd have to connect.
capacity there, they will connect, yeah.
And from looking at, again, not to keep using West Wabasso, but the ownership rate versus non-owner rates, I don't know what the blend is up there. If somebody's got a house and they're renting it, they're probably not gonna wanna run out and do this because they're not gonna be able to change the rent to recoup the funds. It doesn't necessarily create extra value to the tenant. But I would think a number of these are more owner occupied, so that problem's not as much. But in West Wabasso, I know there's some outside owners that if you had a lot that's worth $9,000 and it now has a line assessment and these other items against it, and not too long of a period, the assessments are more than 50% of the value of the lot, or they could grow, you know, over time if they didn't do something. So, all right. So that would be a good problem to have under my first question, that all these people signed up, which it would be, but I just want to make sure we don't. At some point, that's not an unlimited pot of money, but I know we're using other funding sources for that. So. All right, oh, and last thing, and I think it boils down to, in talking with some of the West Wabasso folks and other lower income areas, it's really when they look at what they get per month for Social Security and you take off their basics, if they're paying water and sewer, it could be 8% of their, you know, if they're on the lower end of their monthly, you know, if they're the 781 or 785 folks, it becomes a significant percentage to them. And I've mentioned it before, and someday whenever the billing platform, payment platform changes where we can have that We Care option, I think our community would, you know, if everybody not everybody, but a significant portion rounded up their bill, it would create a lot of money for those folks in Pinson and other places that they don't connect because the thing I hear is, I can't pay the monthly bill. So why am I gonna connect? Even though as much as they would like it, they can't pay that extra amount per month, that their funds are just that restricted. So at some point, maybe we can visit that someday again. Thank you.
Okay. Vinny, could you then please put back up the recommendation? There we go. So commissioners, we have the one impact fee credit scheduled before us. Commissioner Slaughter had proposed more of a 3-year, I would describe. Is there any consensus on which credit scenario?
Will you go through them again?
Okay. Currently, it's 100% if you commit prior to the DEP approval, then 50% if you hook up in the first year, and then nothing after that. Commissioner Slaughter proposed the same 100% credit prior to DEP approval, 75% credit if you hook up in the first year, 50% credit if you hook up in the second year, and then 0 credit with a mandatory hookup in year 3.
I can go with it.
Commissioner Slaughter, you want to make a motion?
Make a motion for staff recommendations with alternative 2 for the impact fee credit, where it is the 100% for those who pre-sign up for it, 75% by the end of year 1, 50% by the end of year 2, 0% year 3 or after, with a mandatory hookup by year 3.
Okay.
Second,
We have a
discussion.
motion from Commissioner Slaughter, second by Commissioner Flesher. Commissioner Flesher, under discussion.
Just one thought. I believe that the proposed element that staff has put forward is far more compulsory, suggestive, and I just have one concern that the graduation might be lost in the time mechanism. In other words, citizens may have faint memories as to when this is being delivered, so, gee, I missed the boat by 3 days, so I have to go to the next discount. Oh, you don't get any discount, now you have to connect. It appears that we would have to do a rather intensive awareness program other than just, here it is. We'll have to have some reminders and postings and maybe some bill inserts, something of that nature. So there might be a little bit of a cost factor with that, but that's the only concern I have, but willing to support it.
Okay, thank you. Any other commissioners' comments? Is there anyone from the public that wishes to speak to the motion before us? Seeing none, all those in favor signify with aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That carries 5-0. And Vinnie, I think we've got one last item for you. This is the reserve accounts.
Oh,
Oh, before we begin, Commissioner Solari, did you want to make your statement at this point? Or?
I did, as a matter of fact. Thank you very much. We're about to talk about reserve accounts, and I just wanted to let the board and the public know that in Wabasso, I have 11 reserve accounts. That group that bought them and anticipating using them sometime in the future, bought them in basically the 1980s when they were first offered. I've been duly paying on them since then, but I checked with the county attorney to see if this might be a conflict. He told me, and basically his email says, based on the information received from utilities, your interest is small enough that it is not deemed to be a conflict. That is, the group that I'm in is big enough so that my 11 impact fees are less than 1% of the group, I believe, so that it is appropriate for me to be part of this action and to actually vote in it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Vinnie,
All right,
please.
thank you. So just going to start out with what a definition of a ERU is for those folks that may or may not know that. In County Code of Ordinance, Section 201.01, an equivalent residential unit, otherwise known as an ERU, is the amount of water used or wastewater produced in a typical residential unit from 0 to 300 gallons on a maximum basis, but typically 250 gallons per day on an average basis. For manufactured home communities, there's a scale factor of 0.85 that's used and applied to the residential ERUs. So in the packet on page 1, we had broke out the water and sewer, listing all the accounts. We have 1,970 reserve accounts and 8,147 reserve ERUs. Reserve being held with capacity, bought and paid for, built, but not used, not an active ERU. So ERU cost of September 30th and really since 1999 has been unchanged, $1,300 per water ERU, $2,796 per sewer ERU. If you look at the monthly service availability charge, this is the cost that we as a utility incur to maintain said capacity, either at the water plant or at the wastewater treatment facility for said ERU. And then we're getting reimbursed by our customers for that capacity that is not used but could be used should the connection be made. So for one ERU, that water is just over $9, sewers close to $16 a month. So if you had one water and one sewer ERU, you're paying close to $25 a month for service availability charge, regardless of any consumption. And then just for illustration purposes, we had 50 ERU shown for, say, a large development. As you can see, it's quite costly from a cash flow basis on a month-to-month basis. As of June 30th, 2018, the total accounts receivable, the AR, was close to $9 million. The AR past due reserves are just over $5 million. So we wanted to illustrate and go through the different types of reserve ERUs. The first one, which will be the easy one, and they get a little progressively harder as we go through this, is the building permit reserve ERUs. Right now, we do have 790 reserve accounts, which equates to 803 ERUs. and there's some potential scenarios for consideration. In this case, most of these are going to be active within a short amount of time, therefore they really don't present any kind of problem. And what normally happens is the reserve ERU is out there, the account becomes active, connects to the system, the structure's built, and it's so longer a reserve ERU, it goes into active basis, and life is good. Everything's hunky-dory. In some cases, the account is kept current, but is not activated for reasons that might be outside of what's known. Either financing falls through, or the property owner is not ready to build on a said property. There's another scenario where the account is not kept current and is not activated. So it'd be a reserve ERU that is behind in its service availability charges. The other one is there's existing account is kept current but not activated, or the account is not kept current and is still not activated. So again, the majority of the building permit reserve ERUs will connect to the system within a short amount of time and become active accounts. There is not a code allowance for those who choose or do not connect. And so we have a couple recommendations, and we would say that if the account becomes active in a short amount of time, then staff would recommend that we do nothing. It goes through the normal process. The second scenario is if it's current but not activated, there may be an issue where something has changed. There may be an allowance for the refund of fees. If that's the original purpose of said capacity reservation, they keep their account current and they request that within a 24-month of purchase. So we currently don't have anything in place right now with respect to the marketplace changing or something happening on a personal note where they initially thought they were going to use that ERU for some reason. It did not happen. Maybe they're keeping it current. We would recommend allowance to modify code and then refund those fees. The other scenario is if someone chose to reserve said capacity, but they're not keeping current, they have not activated, we kind of get ahead of this and don't let this thing escalate out of control, which is what's happened on some of the other ARs, but allow a partial refund of impact fees that have been paid with foregoing the investment in that capacity.
Benny, just a second. Jason, how long is a building permit good for?
I think it's typically 1 year if there's not an extension or not any activity.
So your number 2 scenario then, and 3, I guess, they've pulled the building permit and paid their impact fee, but that building permit expires in a year. So, and then you've got down there in the fine print for 24 months of purchase. So do we want to just make that 12 because the building permit would have expired, or?
Could align it with the building permit, sure. I mean, this was an attempt looking at what had been in code before, but I think we'll know right away. You know, we certainly don't want to wait 24 months to have something go out, but we wanted to make sure that there was not some small hiccup that would cause an issue with respect to the capacity that's been reserved, so.
Can they get an
I
extension
think
of 12
yeah,
months?
they can get extension. I think it's without activity for that year, because sometimes
So
it may
then the
take you
24 months would make
more-
sense then.
yeah, more than a year to construct
Okay.
some structures.
Thank you, Benny, sorry.
Second one is a voluntary assessment. In this case, back in the 80s, they had a unique scenario where there were voluntary reservation of capacity in lieu of an impact fee that had been paid. So in other words, the property was assessed, and if that property ever then built a structure, they would not have to pay an impact fee. In this case, it was a voluntary basis. Many ERUs were reserved. In this case, we currently have 1,277 water and sewer ERUs. And the annual revenue from the service availability fee, is $225,269. So some of the scenarios for consideration where the account is kept current, the property is undeveloped, and service is available within 200 feet, we would say then maybe they can choose to keep their investment. The account is kept current for number 2. The property is undeveloped and service is not available within 200 feet. That's a unique situation. The account is not kept current, property is undeveloped, and service is available with 200 feet. You know, maybe they connect it after the structure is built. Or item scenario number 4 is the account is not kept current, property is undeveloped and service is not available within 200 feet. Number 5 is the account is current, property is developed, it's within 200 feet but not connected. And lastly, the account is not current, property is developed, it's within 200 feet but not connected. So based on some of those different scenarios, some account holders have no plans to develop. Perhaps they're not the original property owner. Maybe they are. Certainly, there's no code allowance currently for relinquishments of the reserves, so we have folks that have called the office to say how they could get out of these ongoing service availability charges that occur from month to month. So we've tried to at least do a little matrix to identify staff recommendation based on those different scenarios. So for this first scenario, the account is kept current, the property is undeveloped, and service is available within 200 feet. Maybe they are choosing not to do something at this point. Staff would recommend to allow for relinquishment of said ERU capacity. In scenario number 2, the account is kept current, the property is undeveloped, and service is not available within 200 feet. We would allow for a refund of said capacity. Number 3, account is not kept current, property is undeveloped, and service is available within 200 feet. We'd ask the property owner to bring the account current and then allow for relinquishment. Number 4, account is not kept current, and the property is undeveloped. We'd certainly ask to bring the account current and then allow a refund. Number 5, the account is current, property is developed, and the service is available within 200 feet but not connected. We don't recommend anything at that particular time. And then lastly, for number 6, account is not current, the property is developed, and service is available within 200 feet but not connected. To perhaps look at the 90-day amnesty to bring the account current, perhaps some research logistics of foreclosure. Type 3, this is the big elephant in the room, the planned unit development reserves. You can see the reserves are 6,067 reserves, just under $1 million in annual revenue to the utility service for reimbursement of the capacity that, again, has been bought and paid for, that we incur costs to keep the lights on and the pumps running. The refund amount, if you were to refund all that money, would be $12.5 million. So scenarios for consideration: if the account is current, the developer may still plan to utilize the reserve. Second scenario, the account is current, developer doesn't want or need all of the reserves, maybe a portion of the reserves, what to do with that scenario. And then lastly, the existing account is not current. So 15 of the 944 planned unit development accounts make up over 50% of the total accounts receivable. Again, that's for costs that we incur that have been billed but have not been paid. Some of the account holders have more than reserves than they want or need, or some of the development changes have occurred since 2004 or 5, and so there's a discrepancy between what they would be allowed to build versus what the comp plan would allow. And right now, there's no code allowance for the relinquishment of said reserves. So the first scenario recommendation: if the account is current, the developer still plans to utilize the reserves, staff would recommend to do nothing. Again, these are for the large plan unit development. If the second scenario is if the account is current and the developer doesn't want or need all of the reserves, I would modified code to allow relinquishment with no refund of just those excess reserves that would not be needed for build-out. And lastly, if the account is not current, prior to researching the logistics of foreclosure, kind of give one last time. I realize that we've done a couple amnesty periods in the past, but we would provide kind of like a final, if you want to maintain your investment, here's your time to do so. Amnesty period where some of the penalties and interests are basically waived in exchange for bringing the account current. Otherwise, we would then look at options for foreclosure. So recommendations: staff would ask the Board of County Commissioners permission to modify county code to allow for the refund of impact fees paid if such a request is made within 24 months of the purchase of the ERUs. And this staff is recommending that this modification become effective January 2019. So we'd have to work with the county's attorney's office to do a public notice, public hearing to modify that code, again with an effective date of January 1. Second is to modify county code to allow for the relinquishment of ERUs purchased during one of the voluntary assessment programs, provided that the property remains undeveloped and/or service is not available within 200 feet of the parcel. Such relinquishment shall include a refund of any impact fees paid if service is unavailable within 200 feet of the property. And we would require that accounts be brought current before allowing any such relinquishment. Third, modify county code to allow for the relinquishment of ERUs purchased at any time if the build-out of the property under the current comp plan does not allow for utilization of all ERUs affiliated with the property. In essence, if someone had reserved, say, 100, or a developer had reserved 100 ERUs, right now, current code based on stormwater drainage and setbacks would say only 80 reserves could be built out. You have a delta of 20 reserves. This would allow for the relinquishment of those excess reserve ERUs that could not be used. We would ask that, the ERUs purchased within the past 24 months, relinquishment shall not include a refund of impact fees, but we would want to make sure that the accounts would be brought current before any such relinquishment could be allowed to occur. Fourth, to modify county code, to accommodate the county reclaiming any ERUs wherein 24 months of service availability fees are past due. So if somebody chooses not to keep their account current for which their capacity reservation has been made, the county would then look at taking some fees, and they would basically give up their investment for that ERU. And fifth, modify county code to provide a 90-day amnesty period subject to board approval that would provide the property owner an opportunity to bring their account current, number one, and then secondarily to relinquish any excess ERUs on the account once it becomes current. And lastly, direct staff to research the logistics of foreclosing on properties that have excess of accounts receivable balances at that time. So a lot of information. I appreciate the opportunity to go through some of these things. Again, certainly available for any questions that the board may have.
Commissioner Solari.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As Vinny's going to be unsurprised, I've got a number of issues with this. Vinny, could you give me the philosophy between the difference between 1 and 3, where if somebody's had the ERU for 24 months, you'll buy them back, but if somebody has had them for 30 years and is current and has paid all their fees for 30 years, you won't buy them back?
I think number 3 is on a going forward basis
Yes,
that
both
we're
of them,
looking at,
yes,
yeah.
both of them are moving forward.
That we change that policy so we don't get into this situation going forward, right?
So 1 and 3 are just going forward? 3's not, I don't understand the response, Mr. Brown.
3 includes those that were purchased some time ago, as well as ones that were purchased within 24 months, but now they have more than they can utilize on that piece of property.
No, but the 24 months, number 1, is if you've bought them within the last 24 months, you can return them and get what you've paid back, as I understand it.
Yeah, anytime after January 1st, so that rule would go into effect. So if that occurs after January 21st, it'll be 24 months since that time, but it would not be retroactive.
Okay, but again, what would be the philosophy for, aside from the retroactivity then, between wanting to go forward and pay for somebody who's within the first 24 months, or return the fee for somebody within the first 24 months, but not the people who have been, from the voluntary assessment, who've been paying for 30 years?
Right, and that's what we're suggesting, is to say, if you've been paying for all this time, and you do not have a property that's developed, and you're outside the 200-foot, you can, 1, relinquish, and also ask for a refund of the monies that have been paid, assuming your account is kept current.
Okay, so again, I don't know if it's for mine, for instance, or within 200 feet or not, but for me, if somebody who is current, anybody who's current, and they want to return an impact fee the way it used to be the county policy to do it, where you're basically exchanging it with somebody who wants to use an ERU, then there is absolutely no financial impact on the utility, and the capacity is paid for, and both sides are basically in good shape. I don't understand why you wouldn't simply, again, in the past, for those people who had the voluntary assessments, say from the 80s, if for at least the first 14 and probably 20 years after the assessments were paid for, if they wanted to relinquish them, they got paid the value for them if there was another person who wanted to get an ERU. And when that happened, the utility had no financial impact for it, and the utility was not, in my view, unjustly enriched by being paid for the same capacity twice. And to me, that would be the best policy going forward. It also does something which I think this board for a few years has been trying to do, and that is to unlock ERUs that are reserved but are not utilized, and that you're not having customers who have the reserves aren't utilizing them, but you have to keep the capacity reserved for. I mean, in my situation, it's really good government-itis, because I don't know if I had 2 houses on it, so I'm not sure if that's developed or undeveloped. It's commercial property, and the idea was someday you'd develop commercially. So that's why there are 11 ERUs on it. But it becomes more absurd because I'm now told that FDOT wants to buy the property to use for a pond, in which case they'll have no use for ERUs, but I'm certainly not going to relinquish them for no compensation today, which means you're forced to just have them on the books as reserve ERUs. You can't get the benefit of having customers for them, but then I'm going to make FDOT pay a fortune for buying the ERUs from me, which then they can get no value for. I mean, it's just absurd. But again, back after the voluntary assessment was made, for at least 14, probably 20 years, until the Great Recession is when I think it stopped, there was simply utility used as a conduit between people who had ERUs but weren't going to use them and people who wanted to make sure they had the capacity and wanted to use them. The benefit was to both parties there, but also to the utility, because then they got a customer which was actually using the utility and paying for the monthly operation for it. And to me, that's a much, much better way of going forward. And I can't imagine why, aside, again, from unjust enrichment to the utility, why we wouldn't go forward that way now. So I'm trying, I've had numerous conversations with you and with Mr. Brown about this, and I haven't gotten anything what I would call a justifiable philosophy to back up this decision.
I would say from staff standpoint, I wouldn't say there's no impact, there's no negative cash flow impact on the utility for refunding them because you have someone coming forward to buy the new ones. However, I would say that the utility doesn't get the cash flow from that new person that's purchasing the impact fees.
Yeah, you're saying that the utility doesn't get paid for the same capacity twice. And I think that that would be good public policy, that the utility is not paid for the same capacity twice.
Well, I think that's, the policy there does provide for a refund of the impact fees if they are not served. If they are served, the capacity's been built. I would argue if we've got service within 200 feet of the property, we've built the sewer plant, we've built the lines all the way to the property. And so the capacity has been built. The other purchasers building capacity is buying capacity elsewhere.
Capacity's been built. I say that right off the bat. But you have somebody who's now going to use that capacity. So they are paying for the capacity is paid for one way or the other. And so what it's not done is that capacity is not paid for twice, which under number 3 is likely to happen often. And that's the problem. The same capacity ought not be paid by the public twice. And the only reason this is possible is because the utility has a monopoly on the service. And so it can make this type of requirement, we'll say.
I'll elaborate a little bit if I could. And I see where you're coming from, and I agree with it partly, and it doesn't really matter what I agree with or don't agree with, because I'm not making the decision here. But just so you know where staff was coming from, kind of to piggyback what Jason said, we were coming from that perspective because part of your impact fee is for plant capacity. So I can see where if someone comes in, regardless of where they're located in the county, and pays us an impact fee, the capacity that your I don't mean your personally, the person in the voluntary assessment had paid for in the plant is no longer gonna be used. So philosophically, it would make sense, okay, the new person would be utilizing and paying that fair share twice. So I can see that piece of it. But the other piece of it is the portion of the impact fee that is used to expand the system for transmission and collection. So an example I can think of off the top of my head is Roseland Road. We did a voluntary assessment that was for the north part of the county, encompassed Indian River Drive, Roseland Road, and a little bit of US 1 on the very northern part of the county. If you look at the language in the voluntary assessment, the funds were specifically to bring sewer to that area. The county built a large force main, miles and miles of force main, utilizing those funds that were collected during that voluntary assessment. So at least a portion of what that impact fee was to cover back then, I don't know if it was we can look back at 99, but I can't tell you what the percentage was in 89. But say 60% was for distribution or collection and 40% was for plant capacity, then from our perspective, 60% of that funds isn't being replaced by the new person coming in unless they so happen to be in that same area. So just trying to explain where our head was at.
No, that's a partial explanation, and I can understand that. At this point, though, I mean, for the voluntary assessment, it gets me that, so right off the bat, it says these were voluntary assessments. Absolutely true. Voluntarily did it and accepted that I had to pay for it, paid for it for 30 years. You've now, for 11 assessments, got about $65,000. All understood, my responsibility. One of the two worst financial decisions I ever made, but I'm good with that. Has nothing to do with you. But then to tell me that there's no value to that after that time, I find to be incredibly problematic. And we spend a lot of money trying to make the utility system so that it basically is interconnected. So, you know, some of that, your argument to me is sort of washed away by that over time. So I still believe that those people who have had these assessments for a long time have paid for it. And I believe that these type of fees are what has allowed the utility to go without a rate increase since 1999, because you've had the flow of these funds coming in. So that's all good. So existing customers have benefited tremendously. But again, you still have the problem, if the right thing isn't done with these ERU reserves, that these reserves are still going to be frozen. That you'll still have to have the capacity, theoretically at least, that you don't get the added value of the capacity, and that the exchange of goods is not made in the marketplace, which slows down development and stuff like that. So it's interestingly that the idea of expanding sewer and water in Sebastian is good for economic development, but doing the right thing for these people who have been supportive of the utility for the last 30 years is not good for the development. And a smaller note, I find it offensive that those of us, the 90%, if I read the staff report right, who have for 30 years paid these base facility charges, end up being able to relinquish their accounts. Bad players who have not, and who have time and time again perhaps not paid their bills, if they simply make them current, they're treated the same way. So that's just a little other irksome thing, but no need to go on. But I mean, I just fundamentally believe that it's unjust enrichment to the utility. It's not the right things for the citizens. There's no reason for them to be paid, the county to be paid for the same thing twice. The only reason the county is able to do this is because it is a monopoly, basically. And I find for those reasons that I certainly can't support number 3. And again, you have the absurd thing that you have, mine will be frozen because FDOT's going to pay for it. And they're going to, then FDOT, other taxpayers will be out the money for it. And I'll have the public record of this meeting saying that the National Utility Department wouldn't do the right thing at that time, so you're going to have to pay for my base facility charges for the last 35 years.
Staff is certainly open to other options. I just was trying to share with you where we were going.
No, I'm good.
Right.
I think I've probably about covered that, unless Jason wants to say something else that I have to disagree with.
Well, and I understand where you're coming from, and, you know, this is staff's recommendation. We could be agreeable to changing that to where it's not within the 200 feet as a requirement that can be reimbursed. I would say they need to be in good standing. They need to have been in good standing, would be my argument, but at least, or at least they would have to be in good standing at a minimum to be able to get a refund of the impact fees paid.
And I mentioned to you before, I'd be happy to say that they had to have been and maintained in good standing. That's fine, because they've played the game and played it correctly. And I'm also happy to say that it's not all done at one time to everybody, that it's on some objective standard where the payments for the reserved ERUs are made when somebody else wants to use a reserved ERU. And quite frankly, we set up something in the item just before this where the county is in effect going to have to buy ERUs from the utility in order to do its septic to sewer. So between that and normal building that's being taken place, it shouldn't take too long to go through most of the ERUs that people, reserve ERUs that people want to return. So I think that can be in an orderly fashion. And again, this was done up until, I think, the Great Recession for almost 20 years with no problem to the utility, the right thing for the community. So it's not anything that we even have to say that we're sort of riskily doing as an experiment, because it was already done for years in this county.
Commissioner Zork, did you have a question or comment?
Just a question. I guess it was about 8 or 9 months ago, we had the folks at Indian River Boulevard and 12th Street, where they were originally designed as build out at a higher density, and then if your footprint was the equivalent of 3 of the multifamily units and it became 1 unit, they were getting billed for the other base facility charge for those other ERUs. And on those, we kind of just called it a day, they surrendered them, and then they were paid for once, kept current, and then they went back into the system and are now gonna be sold again.
That was, in particular, it was Province Bay, but it is going to happen. There's currently some plat modifications going on in some other areas where that same scenario is potentially gonna take place. So we had been approached by many homeowners who unknowingly were sold one of the units that had more than 1 ERU with it. So now this is, because right now, currently in county code, which a lot of what we're talking about, of course, we're gonna have to update code to accommodate, and that's, change is a good thing in a lot of cases, right? But so what we did in that case was, because these homeowners were sold these units, and what happened was people actually were talking to their neighbors, and it's like, hey, my water bill's only like $30 a month. I can't believe how cheap it is in here in Indian River County. And then the next guy's going, wow, how do you only spend $30 a month? Mine's like 60. Well, they started comparing notes. They started calling us and asking questions. And then we were explaining, well, you're one of the unlucky people where the developer took 3 lots and made it 2. And they had to tell us, okay, where do you want 2 ERUs and where do you want 1? And you're the unlucky guy because you bought the house with the 2. Your next door neighbor was the lucky guy with the 1. So we did come before the board and asked to update county code to accommodate. And the condition we put there was after 12 months, the homeowner could apply for, again, it was a relinquishment, as your point is, a relinquishment of that second ERU if indeed their usage showed they didn't need it. And of course, all of those were, I think down there they were actually townhomes.
Right.
So of course they didn't need it. And then we relinquished it, and then after a year of them owning that house, they were still stuck for a year, paying a higher, 2 service availabilities, in other words, instead of 1. So that was a good example of where that happened, and it's going on with some other modifications right now.
And I think this is kind of a global solution. It's not perfect, but it's probably a better solution in the big picture maybe than what we did at Providence. That fixed their issue, but I think this is a better overall. And when you do something overall, not every scenario, every peg's gonna fit in every slot perfectly. Every scenario is a little bit different, but in concept, it does a pretty good job. You've tried to cover each unique scenario where you have the folks that have more than they could ever fit on their property. Then you have the 200-foot rule. So you have they put a lot of consideration in to try to hopefully put this to bed the last time, we hope. I mean, we think, but you guys have had to spend a lot of time figuring how to address everything. So you could do the Providence ones one-off over and over and over again, but this is a better solution to try to, again, not always perfect, but I think it's close enough that it's worth consideration moving forward.
So, from what I understand, if we're gonna allow them to relinquish the ERUs, but we're not gonna give them a refund, and then we have an ERU available for the next person that comes in, is that correct? And Commissioner Solari's point is that someone's already paid for that ERU, and now we're gonna sell it again and kind of double dip, is that?
The way I see it, yes.
So, can we take some of those ERUs that we are relinquishing that have already been paid and use them for the septic to sewer projects where we are coming in and we've got 10, 20, 30 ERUs that have already been paid for, and we use that as part of the incentive package to get people to hook up?
So maybe instead of having to dip into the portion that would be optional sales tax or another funding source that allows for payment of impact fees, we would have a bank of some of these relinquished impact fees, so to speak, and then as folks come in and qualify for either the 100% or the 75 or 50%, then you're saying utilize that bank first to cover that. I mean, that's certainly
But then you have service
That's a good
an
comment.
option, but then,
not paid for a certain period.
yeah, that would be my only question would be, so under that scenario, would we create this bank, which would be a data set, in other words, but in the interim of when, say, somebody on Roseland Road, not somebody on US 1, decides they want to relinquish some of those ERUs, would they continue to pay service availability until we reassigned it, or would we abate them? I mean, those are just some things that we would have to look at and assure that we addressed when we modify the code, that's all.
Mhm.
So those are just some other questions that come to, the finance person and the,
Well, I was
Checkbook
just
holder and
assuming that if we
utilities.
allow somebody to relinquish the ERU, the service availability charge would stop. Is that correct?
well, I can tell, what was done I think the system Commissioner Solari was referring to that had been done for a long time. I've been with the utility a little over 14 years now, and when I came here, I actually didn't have a lot of requests when I first came here. Prior to my time, there were folks that were asking for refunds that bought them, like during the voluntary, and I have found evidence that they were just refunded. They actually, back then, there was a paper copy of the roll, and if you go back and find our old books with these paper rolls, and you'll see somebody's handwriting where they crossed out, Cindy Correnti had 20, crossed out 15. Well, I assume they were refunded the 5, and looking at the language that was even in that resolution that was attached to this agenda item, the 87-142, you were allowed to relinquish at that time. So I think that's probably the system Commissioner Solari is referring to. And then I came here just prior to the crazy period in 04, 05, and 06 when people were buying a lot of these ERUs, speculating that they were going to build out. During that time, I had requests come in, and they started to build up, where folks were asking for, I had some of these subdivisions who had 250, 272, and they wanted all of them refunded. Well, come 06, 07, when things started tapering off, we weren't even selling, probably 100 ERUs those years. There were some really lean years then. So at first, when I got requests for 1 or 2, I just honored the request, just like my predecessors had, but kind of got bombarded in a short amount of time where I had requests for hundreds, and I'm looking at the funds new monies, of course. I wasn't looking at fund balance. I was looking at new monies coming in for impact fees and saying, okay, we've got a problem here. And then that's when we talked with some other administrators and the county attorney at the time and kind of put the program in abeyance, only because by that time I had thousands of requests. We had very relatively little new money coming in. We did have a CIP back then that had several impact fee driven projects on the, still on the horizon. We had spent about $80 million in a 3-year period back then. So, and those projects were on the horizon and hadn't been quite paid for yet. So those were some of the things we started juggling and then decided we better put this in abeyance for now. And it has sat in abeyance really since probably, I can't tell you the date off the top of my head. I could look if I go back to my records, but I'm guessing it was sometime in 2007 that kind
So
of just went.
just
to it.
kind of what I'm thinking is, I remember Commissioner Davis always would talk about the rat going through the snake. You know, this is a bubble created from the recession, and at some point it's going to work out, and then, you know, we'll be on level playing ground. And so I think there's a number of these ERUs from the boom days prior to the recession that we need to clear up one way or the other. But we collected those, and I think we've built the capacity to handle those. Is that not correct? And then going forward, where we have a policy in where, you know, okay, if you haven't developed within 24 months, we're yanking them back, and some of these other things, I think will prevent us from getting in this hole again. Is that kind of the thought?
That was it, and the 24-month, and you could pick 12-month, 36, whatever.
Right,
But
we'll
the
have a better
intention was to
handle.
stop
We
the
won't have this
bleeding and
big
not
accumulation.
recreate the problem we have from the boom period.
Okay.
Exactly. Our intention is that let's hope we don't go through a 2008 again, but we will go through a recession again at some point. If we go through a downturn, we're hoping to not create more of these problems that we have here. So we're hoping that we've got a couple of changes that impact the past and then a couple that impact the future, so we don't create more of, the hope is that we don't create more of these.
Right. But just, so my point is, we've got a number of surplus ERUs that have been paid, but we also have already built that capacity. So I get that we don't want to give them a refund. Okay, I'm good with that. But I kind of agree with Commissioner Slur. I don't know if we should be selling them again. And that's where I think if we could use them for these septic to sewer projects, we've already built the capacity, so we're not hurting ourselves, and allow us to use up these ERUs. And if that helps get more people to sign up as we do these projects, and that starts the revenue stream right there. And we could also maybe use these for the, Commissioner, you're concerned about the lower income folks. Like, we could take some of these and get all of West Wabasso hooked up, you know. I could see something like that, and then these other policies going forward keep us from getting in a hole again. So that's kind of.
We certainly could start a database to that effect. One of the other things we would want to talk about and make sure we cover in a policy then is, for purposes of this exchange, is impact fee money, or do we keep water and wastewater ones separate? Because we do have some of both. Looking at septic to sewer, of course, there will be a few pockets where people will have to connect to water as well because it may already be available. But I think we're going to have, with the septic to sewer, probably going to have more of a need for wastewater ERUs than water. So.
And staff would be agreeable.
You know, that's just something to make sure we cover if we develop a policy going forward.
And staff would be agreeable on the voluntary assessments to have a different, to refund those, because I see those as a different scenario from the others. Everywhere else, somebody had to buy ERUs because they were going to build a housing development with, they thought 200 houses, so they had to buy the 200 ERUs. They may have changed their plans and they went from townhomes to houses, and they're only doing 180 or whatever. But staff could go along with would go along with refunds for the voluntary assessments, only because there's just a differentiation there from the, you know, it speaks voluntary assessment. It's obviously something that's I don't know how they got folks to agree to that. That's before my time, but they must have had some good PR folks to get folks to do voluntary assessments. So I see that as a little bit of a different scenario there.
So, Commissioners, it's been a long day. and I hate to keep putting Vinnie off more and more, but item one, since it has an effective date of January 1, maybe we could take action on that. And I think there's a couple of people that might want to speak, but if we hold off on 2 through 6 for a couple more meetings, would that be a problem for staff?
No.
Okay, but if we take action on number 1 going forward, and that way we have that effective by January 1st.
Mr. Chairman, I'll move recommendation number 1 to modify the county code to allow to the refund of impact fees paid if such request is made within 24 months of the purchase of the ERUs.
Okay, is there a second for that? Yes. Motion by Commissioner Solari, second by Commissioner Flesher. Folks in the audience, did you want to speak to item 1, or are you on 2 through 6? Great, thank you. Any discussion on the commissioners? All those in favor signify with aye. Any opposed? That carries 5-0. So that, just for that one, the number 1 recommendation on the screen before us. Gentlemen, if you want to come up and talk to any of these items now, would be a good time.
It's probably been about 6 months ago I came before you to talk about another amnesty.
Richard, if you give your name and address,
Oh,
please.
excuse me. David Etter, 9086
David.
Castle Harbor.
That's why you had to do that. I was calling you David or
We
Richard.
look so similar.
He's rich.
It's a long day.
He's rich, I'm the tall builder. But we came in front of you about 6 months ago to talk about another amnesty period. And the consensus was I should meet with Vinnie and Cindy and work through things, which we did, which came up with a recommendation for the amnesty period. I don't want to plead hardship. When we had cash, we paid the minimum utility charges, and when we didn't, we didn't. Our investor came upon some hard times and said, no cash for building, no cash for anything else, live off your rental income. We're in a position now where we have the property under contract with a regional builder. The contract is probably going to go ahead. It would be a great convenience for us and him to have us immediately pay the minimum utility charges, waive the penalties and interest, and ideally turn in, if possible, 8 ERUs with no refund for it. The reason for turning 8 in, townhouses aren't viable for them to build. They're going to be building larger units and reducing the density by 8 units. This had been put off a couple times, and I didn't hear any mention of when this would be readdressed.
Okay. So basically, that's item number 5 we have here. That would provide a 90-day amnesty period, and that would provide an opportunity to relinquish the ERUs upon becoming current, but no refund of the ERUs. Is that correct, what staff's recommending?
That's how it was written. Mm.
Okay, and the amnesty period would be, as we did in the past, that we would waive the penalties and interest. They would pay the outstanding ready-to-use fees, and that would be the amnesty part?
The intention of the amnesty part, the other piece that really wasn't explained here, but we intended to have to come back with the policy actually written. One of the other staff concerns I just want the board to be aware of before they vote on this item is there are some folks who took advantage of amnesty in the past, had hundreds of thousands of dollars or sometimes tens of thousands of dollars written off in penalties, caught their account up, and then never paid us a dime again. From a staff perspective, I'm not so sure those folks should be eligible for amnesty again. So if staff were to write a policy, we would come back with a policy that said if you've taken advantage of it once and did not keep your account current, you would not be eligible for this special one. But that's just a thought another thing to put in your head to complicate things today.
I mean,
That wouldn't apply to.
That doesn't not apply to this case, no.
for me, amnesty is, you get one amnesty, and then
Right.
that should cure whatever has happened in the past, and you are required to keep it up from there. It's not, you'd let it ride until another amnesty period. I mean, that's,
And we've had that, and some folks have already done it twice, so. So
for
we could
me,
say that.
I'm fine with a policy that says you get one amnesty period.
Okay. Could you all bring something, a specific amnesty policy back to us on the 4th of December? Okay, and then just,
You have time to.
We have to advertise?
Yeah, it's an ordinance code change. We're gonna have to make sure we've got the 10-day time period.
well, I'm thinking more, this would be us to give them approval to move forward with an ordinance change.
Oh, okay.
We could still advertise it and make.
That's fine. I thought you said you wanted the ordinance to come back on December 4th.
No, just
No,
a
okay.
specific plan for the ordinance. Okay, all right. So it'll still take a few weeks after that, David. It probably won't become effective. We'd have to advertise it. We could probably get it to the December 18th meeting, 2 weeks after the 4th,
Got it. Oh.
or not?
I mean, if the board's okay, we could advertise ahead of time for the December 18th meeting. At least that way we've got the notice in the paper for the public hearing in the necessary amount of time, if the board's comfortable with advertising before it sees the plan. And if the board's comfortable with that, then I think we're fine on the timing.
Just a
Well,
little-
if we don't like it, we just cancel it, and we've advertised for nothing. I mean, okay.
just a little bit more pressure on Vinnie to deliver a perfect product. Which should
So-
be no problem.
So then, David, we would have the public hearing on the 18th. We'll shoot for that. And then there'll be an effective date. Would it be on the 18th when we approve it, or like somewhere around January 1st, or?
It's a board's call. I mean, obviously, it's the discretion of the board to decide what day the ordinance goes into effect and then start the 90-day period. I mean, it would certainly be fine.
The 18th would be excellent for us.
Okay. So commissioners, that's what I would recommend, is that we table items 2 through 6. I'm sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry, yeah, Commissioner Adams, you had a comment.
So while we're gathering information and creating a policy, I don't see why we couldn't also address item 6, because it's just directing staff to research and bring back some logistics of how that would work. So then we can have a more robust discussion. Because I think that's
We
gonna
have
require.
a motion by Commissioner Adams for item number 6. Is there a second? We have a second by Commissioner Flesher. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor signify with aye. Aye. Opposed? That carries 5-0, and that was staff recommendation number 6. Okay, so then, Commissioners, what I would recommend is we table recommendations 2 through 5.
3, 5.
Well, they're gonna bring back a specific plan to go to an ordinance. So, recommend that staff comes back to us on December 4th with additional information on items 2 through 5, including a specific amnesty plan, and we will proceed with a advertisement to have a public hearing on that ordinance change on December 18th. And we can do that without a motion, Commissioners, if it's the consensus of the board. Go ahead, Dylan.
Dylan wants a motion, so I make whatever you just said a motion.
Okay.
Second.
We have a motion from Commissioner Adams, second by Commissioner Flesher, to table items 2 through 5 to December 4th with additional staff work on them. Does that work for you? And a public hearing on the 18th.
That's exactly what my motion was.
I knew it. I knew you were just such a shining light. All right, any discussion on that, Commissioners?
Clarification. Sorry.
Jason's gonna
This'll
rain
be
on our
short.
parade.
So we're gonna bring back just we're planning to do the amnesty hearing on the 18th? Are we planning to do any others, like item number 1?
I
was
heard,
approved today?
yeah, I heard I'm going to be bringing back the Utilities Department of the County Attorney's Office will work to get the item number 1 either the board on the 11th or 18th, whenever we can fit it in per advertising.
Okay, but the others would come back at a later date for their ordinance later than December 18th,
I think so, yeah.
2, 3, 4, and
I think the only one we'll advertise would be possibly 1 and number 5.
1 and 5. Okay, thank you.
All right, well, Commissioners, we have a motion and a second. Motion by Commissioner Adams, second by Commissioner Flesher. All in favor signify with aye. Any opposed? That carries 5-0. And Commissioners, I believe that concludes the agenda for today.
Mr.
Thank you
Chairman,
all for your patience and time. Commissioner Flesher.
Is this your last meeting as chairman?
It is correct, well, technically, no, I'll open the meeting next week.
Or your last full meeting?
My last full meeting, yes, Commissioner.
And I have to say, it was a distinct privilege and honor to work underneath your tutelage as the chairman of the county commission this year. I think today we put you to the test.
I'm thinking Commissioner Slaughter is probably not going to agree with you, given it's almost his dinner time and bedtime, but
All in one.
I greatly appreciate your comments,
thank you.
Commissioner Flesher, and I look forward to passing the gavel. It's been a great year, and I'm sure the new chairperson coming in will also do a great job, and we'll do it then. And you and I will be getting sworn in next week,
Yes, yes.
by the way, so
Stay tuned.
we'll have Judge Morgan here. Anybody else for the good of the community? Seeing none, we're adjourned.